At 37,000 feet, with 243 souls trapped in a metal coffin, screaming toward the Atlantic Ocean, the flight attendant's voice cracked over the intercom. "Is there anyone on board with combat flight experience?" In seat 8A, a tired black father in wrinkled clothes opened his eyes. He had buried that pilot 10 years ago. But the dead don't stay buried when children are falling from the sky. If you want to see how one invisible man becomes the only thing standing between life and death, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The red-eye from London to New York was never supposed to be anything more than a routine crossing. Flight 447, an Airbus A330 carrying 243 passengers through the dark Atlantic corridor, pushed steadily westward at 37,000 feet, its twin engines humming the monotonous lullaby of modern aviation. Below, an infinite carpet of clouds obscured the ocean, and above, stars scattered across a moonless sky like diamonds spilled on black velvet. In seat 8A, pressed against the window in economy class, Daniel Brooks slept the fitful sleep of the perpetually exhausted. His head rested against a balled-up jacket he'd wedged between his temple and the cold plastic of the window frame. His breathing came slow and heavy, punctuated occasionally by the unconscious twitch of fingers that had once wrapped around control sticks in aircraft far more dangerous than this one. At 41 years old, Daniel wore his fatigue like a second skin, visible in the gray threading through his close-cropped hair, in the lines carved around his eyes, in the slight slump of shoulders that had once carried the weight of missions he would never speak about. To anyone passing through the aisle, he was invisible. A middle-aged black man in economy class, dressed in faded jeans and a wrinkled Henley that had seen better days. No expensive watch, no designer luggage, no air of importance that might cause a flight attendant to pause and offer an extra pillow or a warmer smile. He was simply another tired body occupying another cheap seat, easily overlooked, instantly forgotten. The woman beside him, a blonde in her 50s with diamond studs and a cashmere wrap, had made her assessment of Daniel within seconds of boarding. She'd watched him settle into his seat, had noted his worn sneakers and the small duffel bag he'd stuffed under the seat in front of him, and had immediately angled her body toward the aisle, creating as much distance as the cramped quarters would allow. She hadn't spoken a single word to him in the 6 hours since takeoff. Not a greeting, not an excuse me, nothing. Daniel hadn't noticed. Or if he hadn't cared. His mind, even in sleep, was 3,000 miles behind him, anchored to a small apartment in Brooklyn where his 7-year-old daughter Maya was staying with his sister Denise. He'd left Maya with promises of bringing back British chocolate and stories about the airplanes he'd seen at Heathrow, carefully omitting the real reason for his trip. A consultation with a specialist about a combat injury that had never quite healed, a constant reminder of the life he'd walked away from. In his dreams, Maya was laughing. She was running through Prospect Park with her braids flying behind her, turning back to make sure he was following, her gap-toothed smile brighter than any sun he'd ever seen. "Come on, Daddy, you're so slow!" And he was chasing her, always chasing her, his heart full of a love so fierce it sometimes frightened him. He'd given up everything for that little girl, his career, his identity, his place among the elite few who'd earned the right to call themselves combat pilots. 10 years ago, he'd been Captain Daniel Brooks, one of the most decorated pilots in the Air Force's Classified Special Operations Division. He'd flown missions that would never appear in any official record, delivered payloads that changed the course of conflicts no one would ever know about, and walked away from explosions that should have killed him 3 times over. And then Aaliyah had died. His wife. His anchor. The woman who'd made all of it bearable. She'd been driving home from her shift at the hospital. She was a nurse, always taking care of everyone else. When a drunk driver ran a red light and ended everything in a single catastrophic instant. Maya had been 2 years old. Daniel had held his daughter at the funeral, her tiny body pressed against his chest, and he'd made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would be there. Every morning when she woke up, every evening when she went to sleep, every scraped knee, every nightmare, every first day of school, every moment that mattered. He would never again be the father who was always deployed, always classified, always somewhere else saving strangers while his own child grew up without him. So he'd resigned his commission. He'd walked away from everything he'd trained for, everything he'd bled for, everything that had made him exceptional. He'd taken a job as a maintenance supervisor at a small regional airport in New Jersey, close enough to use his technical expertise, far enough from the sky to keep his promise. He'd learned to cook Maya's favorite meals, to braid her hair, to help with homework he barely understood, to be present in ways he'd never known a father could be. The pilot had died so the father could live, and Daniel had made peace with that. Or at least, he'd convinced himself he had. Now, somewhere over the Atlantic, the aircraft gave a subtle shudder that penetrated even the deepest layers of Daniel's exhaustion. His eyes didn't open, but something shifted in his breathing. Something ancient and trained and never quite forgotten stirred in the base of his skull. 30 feet away, in the cockpit of Flight 447, Captain Richard Harmon was staring at his instrument panel with the first cold fingers of genuine fear wrapping around his spine. Harmon was 58 years old, a 30-year veteran of commercial aviation with more than 20,000 hours in his logbook. He'd seen storms that turned day into night, mechanical failures that would make for excellent dinner party stories, and passengers who made him question his faith in humanity. He was unflappable, steady, the kind of captain other pilots wanted to fly with, but he had never seen anything like this. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the ambient hum of the flight deck. His first officer, a younger man named Kevin Chen, looked up from his own instruments. "Captain, look at this." Harmon pointed at the primary flight display, where a cascade of amber warnings had begun to appear like a spreading infection. "I'm getting inconsistent readings from the flight control computers. Alpha and Bravo are showing different attitudes." Chen leaned forward, his brow furrowing. That shouldn't be possible. They're supposed to be redundant." "I know what they're supposed to be." Harmon's jaw tightened. He reached for the overhead panel, cycling through diagnostic screens that only confirmed what his gut was already telling him. Something was wrong, something fundamental, and it was getting worse by the second. The Airbus A330 was a fly-by-wire aircraft, which meant that unlike older planes with direct mechanical connections between the cockpit and the control surfaces, this one relied on computers to interpret pilot inputs and translate them into movements of the ailerons, elevators, and rudder. It was safer, more precise, more efficient, as long as everything worked. When it didn't work, you weren't flying an airplane anymore. You were a passenger. "I'm getting a flight control primary fault," Chen said, his voice climbing half an octave. "Captain, I've got degraded law on my side." "Same here." Harmon's hands moved with practiced precision across the glare shield, checking and rechecking. "We're dropping from normal law to alternate, losing some of the protections. Should we—" The aircraft lurched, not a gentle bump of turbulence, not the gradual shift of changing winds. This was a violent sideways jerk that sent unsecured items sliding across the cockpit and drew a sharp gasp from both pilots. For one horrible instant, the plane seemed to hang in the air, uncertain which direction it wanted to go. Harmon grabbed the side stick and input a correction. The plane responded, but sluggishly, reluctantly, like a horse that wasn't sure it trusted its rider anymore. "What the fuck was that?" Chen's professional composure cracked. "We're losing hydraulic pressure," Harmon pointed at the gauge. "Green system is bleeding out, yellow is compensating, but there. You see that? Yellow is starting to drop too." The implications hit them both simultaneously. The A330's flight control surfaces were powered by 3 independent hydraulic systems: green, yellow, and blue. Losing one was manageable. Losing 2 was an emergency. Losing all 3 was a death sentence. "We need to declare an emergency," Chen said. "Turn back to Shannon. It's the closest—" "We're not making Shannon." Harmon's voice was flat, analytical. The voice of a man whose emotions had taken a temporary leave of absence while his training ran the show. "Look at the rate of pressure loss. We've got maybe 20 minutes before we're in direct law, and after that—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Direct law was the most basic mode of the A330's flight control system, the last line of defense before total failure. In direct law, there were no computerized protections, no automatic stability augmentation, nothing between the pilot's inputs and the raw response of the aircraft. It required constant manual correction, split-second adjustments, and a level of skill that most commercial pilots never needed to develop. It was designed for emergencies that weren't supposed to happen. "I'm declaring an emergency," Harmon said. "Get Gander on the radio. Tell them we need—" The plane lurched again, harder this time, and every light on the master caution panel seemed to illuminate at once. "We're losing the blue system now," Chen shouted over the sudden cacophony of alarms. "All 3 hydraulic systems are failing." Harmon's face went pale. In his 3 decades of flying, through every scenario he'd trained for and imagined, he had never faced the simultaneous failure of all hydraulic systems. It was supposed to be impossible. The systems were designed with triple redundancy, isolated from each other, protected by every safety measure that modern engineering could devise. But here they were. "Okay," Harmon said, his voice steady through sheer force of will. "Okay, we trained for this. We have a procedure." "Do we?" Chen stared at him. "Captain, what procedure covers total hydraulic failure at flight level 370 in the middle of the Atlantic?" Harmon didn't answer. He was already running through options in his head, calculating distances to diversion airports, fuel remaining, rate of descent if they lost all flight control authority. The numbers weren't adding up to anything resembling survival. In the cabin behind them, most passengers remained blissfully unaware that their lives had become a mathematics problem with no good solutions. A few noticed the turbulence. A few felt the subtle wrongness in the aircraft's movement, the way it seemed to hesitate between corrections like a drunk trying to walk a straight line. But turbulence was normal on transatlantic flights, and the cabin crew moved through the aisles with practiced smiles, assuring everyone that there was nothing to worry about. Meredith Walsh, the lead flight attendant, knew better. She'd been flying for 23 years, and she could read an aircraft the way a sailor reads the sea. The moment that first lurch hit, something cold settled in her stomach. When her phone buzzed with a summons to the cockpit, that coldness spread to her chest. "Stay here," she told her colleague, a younger woman named Priya. "Keep everyone calm. I'll be right back." The walk to the cockpit felt like the longest 20 steps of her life. When the reinforced door opened and she saw the captain's face, she understood that calm was about to become impossible. "Meredith?" Harmon didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We have a situation. I need you to make a discreet announcement. We're looking for anyone on board with military flying experience. Combat experience specifically. Not civilian, not sport pilots. Combat." She blinked. "Sir? We're losing flight control. The systems are failing faster than we can compensate, and Kevin and I—" He stopped, took a breath. "There's a procedure, a manual reversion technique. It's designed for exactly this scenario, but neither of us has ever actually done it outside of a simulator. We need someone who's operated aircraft in degraded conditions before. Damaged aircraft, combat conditions. You want me to find a military pilot in the cabin. I want you to find a miracle." Harmon's eyes met hers, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. "Because in about 15 minutes, we're going to be flying this aircraft without computers, without hydraulics, and without any of the systems that make it possible for 2 normal pilots to keep it in the air. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Meredith nodded slowly. "Good. Go." "And Meredith," Harmon called after her, "be discreet. The last thing we need is a panic." She stepped out of the cockpit and closed the door behind her, her mind racing. How the hell was she supposed to find a combat pilot at 37,000 feet without causing a panic? Walk through the aisles asking if anyone had ever shot down an enemy aircraft? Put out an announcement asking veterans to raise their hands? She grabbed the intercom handset, her heart pounding. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your senior flight attendant speaking." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "We're currently experiencing some minor technical difficulties that require specialized assistance. If there is anyone on board with military aviation experience, specifically combat flying experience, please ring your call button or identify yourself to a crew member. Your assistance would be greatly appreciated." She clicked off the intercom and waited. The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. In seat 8A, Daniel Brooks opened his eyes. The fog of sleep clung to him like cobwebs, and for a long moment he wasn't sure what had woken him. Then the words processed through his consciousness. Military aviation experience, combat flying. and something deep inside him went very still. He knew. Before his mind could fully articulate the logic, before he could even begin to process the implications, some ancient instinct that had kept him alive through a dozen missions that should have killed him was already screaming a single truth. This aircraft was in serious trouble. He felt it now that he was awake, the subtle wrongness in the way the plane moved, the microscopic hesitations between adjustments, the barely perceptible asymmetry in how the engines compensated for yaw. To an ordinary passenger, it would be undetectable. To a pilot who'd once flown damaged aircraft through hostile airspace with half his instruments shot out, it was as obvious as a neon sign. They were losing flight control. Daniel's stomach clenched. He looked around the cabin, at the sleeping passengers, at the mother trying to soothe a fussy baby 3 rows up, at the businessman pecking away at his laptop, at the elderly couple holding hands across the armrest. 243 people. 243 lives suspended 37,000 feet above the ocean, and somewhere among them, the crew was hoping to find someone who could help. His hand hovered over the call button. He could press it, stand up, identify himself, walk to that cockpit and do what he'd been trained to do, save these people. But then what? The questions came flooding in, drowning out the instinct that had almost made him act. What would happen when they saw him? A black man in economy class? No credentials, no uniform, claiming to be a combat pilot? They'd think he was crazy. Or worse, a threat. They'd ignore him at best. At worst, they'd have him restrained. And even if they believed him, even if by some miracle they trusted him enough to let him help, what about after? The investigation. The media attention. The exposure of an identity he'd spent 10 years burying. His name would be everywhere. His face would be everywhere. The life he'd built for Maya, the anonymity that protected them both, would be gone forever. She would grow up in the spotlight, the daughter of the hero pilot, never just Maya again. Daniel closed his eyes. He could stay silent. Let someone else volunteer. Surely there was another veteran on board. Surely there was someone better positioned, someone without a daughter waiting at home, someone who didn't have everything to lose. Surely he didn't have to be the one. 15 rows ahead, a man was already rising from his seat. Gregory Patterson was 55 years old, the recently retired CEO of a regional airline that operated commuter routes in the Pacific Northwest. He'd started his career as a pilot, had accumulated thousands of hours in single-engine Cessnas and twin-engine turboprops before trading his wings for a corner office. He was, he believed, exactly what the situation required. "I'm a pilot," he announced to the nearest flight attendant, his voice carrying the confident boom from the man accustomed to being listened to. 20 years of flying experience. What seems to be the problem? Meredith felt a surge of hope as she rushed toward him. "Sir, thank you for responding. If you could come with me." Of course, of course." Patterson smoothed his sport coat and followed her toward the cockpit, nodding graciously at the passengers who turned to watch. He was playing the part already, Daniel noted from his seat, the hero emerging from the crowd, ready to save the day. Daniel watched him go and felt something twist in his gut. 20 years of flying experience. That's what Patterson had said. But he'd also said pilot, not combat pilot. And there was something in his walk, in his posture, in the way he carried himself, that made Daniel's instincts prickle. This was a man who flew into weather, not through fire. A man who handled mechanical problems by declaring emergencies and relying on redundant systems. A man who had never felt an aircraft shudder around him as flak tore through the fuselage, had never had to feel his way home with instruments dark and hydraulics bleeding out. This was not a man who could save Flight 447. Daniel knew it with absolute certainty, the same way he'd known which way to brake when enemy missiles locked onto his signature, the same way he'd known when to push the aircraft beyond its limits and when to coax it gently back from the edge. He knew, and he was choosing to do nothing. In the cockpit, the situation had deteriorated further. Captain Harmon was struggling to maintain altitude, his inputs becoming increasingly aggressive as the flight control computers compensated less and less effectively. Chen was running through emergency checklists with mounting desperation, calling out options that both of them knew were inadequate. When Meredith appeared with Gregory Patterson, both pilots felt a flicker of hope. "I'm Greg Patterson," the man said, extending his hand as though this were a boardroom meeting. "Flew for 30 years before moving into management. How can I help? What aircraft? Harmon asked immediately. Cessna 172s mostly, when I was learning. Later, some King Airs, Beech 1900s. Regional stuff. Chen and Harmon exchanged a look. Sir, Chen said carefully, have you ever operated an aircraft in fly-by-wire degraded modes? Alternate law? Direct law? Patterson's confident expression flickered. Well, no. I flew conventional aircraft, mechanical controls. Have you ever had to manage a multiple hydraulic system failure? No. The aircraft I flew didn't rely on hydraulic flight controls in the same way. Look, I'm sure the principles are completely different. Harmon's voice was flat. Sir, I appreciate you coming forward, but this isn't a situation where general flying experience will help. We need someone who's operated aircraft in severely degraded conditions, combat conditions, aircraft that were damaged, compromised, failing. Patterson's face flushed. I ran an airline. I understand aviation. With all due respect, sir, you understand business. Harmon turned back to his instruments, dismissing the man as completely as if he'd never existed. Meredith, please escort Mr. Patterson back to his seat and make another announcement. Emphasize combat experience, damaged aircraft, military operations. Patterson sputtered protests as Meredith gently but firmly guided him out of the cockpit, but Daniel barely heard them. His attention was fixed on the window, on the darkness pressing against the glass, on the stars that had begun to tilt slightly as the aircraft's attitude wavered. The announcement came again, more urgent this time. Ladies and gentlemen, we are asking specifically for anyone with military combat flying experience. If you have ever operated a military aircraft in combat conditions, if you have experience with damaged aircraft, degraded flight systems, or emergency manual procedures, please identify yourself to a crew member immediately. This is urgent. Around the cabin, passengers were starting to stir. The word urgent had penetrated the cocoon of denial that most of them had wrapped around themselves. Whispers spread like wildfire. What's happening? What's wrong with the plane? Did she say damaged aircraft? Daniel's seatmate, the blonde woman who hadn't spoken to him in 6 hours, suddenly found her voice. Oh my God, she breathed, clutching her cashmere wrap like a security blanket. Oh my God, we're going to crash, aren't we? We're not going to crash. Daniel's voice came out rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw by the war being fought inside him. She turned to look at him for the first time since boarding, her eyes wide with fear. How do you know? Who are you? Who was he? He was Daniel Brooks, father of Maya, maintenance supervisor at a regional airport, a man who fixed planes on the ground, not flew them through the sky. He was Captain Daniel Brooks, special operations pilot, decorated veteran of conflicts that didn't exist in any history book. A man who had once brought a crippled F-16 home on hydraulics and prayers, who had flown attack helicopters through sandstorms with nothing but instinct and faith in his own hands. He was both. He was neither. He was a man suspended between two lives, and the choice he made in the next few seconds would determine which one survived. The plane shuddered again, harder this time, and somewhere in the cabin, a child started to cry. Maya. The thought hit him like a physical blow. What if Maya were on this flight? What if she were one of these passengers, terrified, confused, looking around for someone, anyone, who could help? Would he want the person who could save her to stay silent? To hide behind fear and self-preservation while she plummeted into the ocean? The answer was instantaneous, absolute, brutal in its clarity. No. He would want that person to stand up, to identify themselves, to do whatever it took, sacrifice whatever needed to be sacrificed, to bring his daughter home safe. And if he would expect that of a stranger, how could he offer his own daughter anything less? Daniel pressed the call button. The chime seemed impossibly loud in the anxious quiet of the cabin, and he saw several heads turn in his direction. The blonde woman beside him stared at him with open shock, as though he'd just confessed to a crime. You? She said incredulously. You're a combat pilot? Daniel didn't answer. He was watching the flight attendant, Meredith, her name tag said, as she moved through the cabin toward his seat. Her expression was a carefully controlled mask, but he could see the hope flickering behind her eyes, and beneath that, the fear. She was terrified. They were all terrified. Good. Fear kept you sharp. Fear kept you honest. Sir? Meredith reached his row, her voice pitched low. Did you ring your call button? I did. Daniel stood, unfolding himself from the cramped seat with the economical movements of a man who had spent years operating in confined spaces. He was taller than she'd expected, 6'2", with the lean, corded build of someone who had traded muscle mass for endurance. I have military combat flying experience, 15 years with the Air Force, special operations. Meredith's eyes swept over him, taking in the worn clothes, the tired eyes, the complete absence of anything that suggested authority or expertise. Her hope flickered, wavered. Sir, I appreciate you coming forward, but I flew F-16s, A-10s, MH-60 Pave Hawks. Daniel's voice was quiet but unyielding. I've landed aircraft with complete hydraulic failure. I've operated in degraded fly-by-wire conditions. I've brought planes home that had no business still being in the air. Whatever's happening in that cockpit, I've seen worse and walked away from it. She stared at him. The cabin seemed to have gone silent around them, passengers straining to hear the exchange. Sir, do you have any credentials? Any identification? I have my DD-214 on my phone if you need to verify my service record. But if your pilots are dealing with what I think they're dealing with, you don't have time for a background check. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. How many hydraulic systems have you lost? Meredith's face went pale. That's what I thought. Daniel straightened. Take me to the cockpit, now. For a long moment, she didn't move. He could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. The risk of trusting a stranger against the risk of doing nothing. The chance that he was telling the truth against the chance that he was delusional or dangerous. She was weighing his words against his appearance, his calm against his rumpled clothes. It wasn't fair. It had never been fair. But fairness was a luxury that 37,000 feet and 3 failing hydraulic systems didn't allow. Follow me, Meredith said finally. The walk to the cockpit drew every eye in the cabin. Daniel could feel the stares burning into his back, curious, skeptical, suspicious. He heard the whispers starting before he'd gone 3 rows. Who is that? Is he a pilot? He doesn't look like a pilot. Did you see his clothes? He ignored them. He had learned long ago to ignore the noise, to focus only on the mission, to let everything else fade into background static. Right now, the mission was simple. Get to that cockpit, assess the situation, find a way to save 243 lives. Everything else could wait. Meredith knocked on the cockpit door, then entered a code on the keypad. The lock disengaged with a heavy click. Captain, she said, stepping through the doorway, I have another volunteer. Military experience. What kind of... Harmon started to ask, then stopped as Daniel appeared behind Meredith. The skepticism was instant and obvious. Daniel saw it flash across both pilots' faces, the raised eyebrows, the tightened jaws, the sideways glances that spoke louder than words. They saw what everyone else saw, a black man in economy clothes, claiming expertise that his appearance didn't support. Sir? Harmon's voice was polite but dismissive. I appreciate you coming forward, but You've lost all 3 hydraulic systems. Daniel didn't wait for permission to step fully into the cockpit. His eyes swept across the instrument panels with the automatic efficiency of deep training, cataloging data faster than conscious thought. Green went first, then yellow. Now blue is in critical pressure loss. Your flight control computers are trying to compensate, but they're running out of options. You're in alternate law now, probably minutes from direct law. And when you hit direct law, you're going to be flying this aircraft with raw inputs, no protection, and nothing but your own hands keeping 243 people alive. The cockpit went silent. Chen stared at him. Harmon's hand froze over the throttle. How the hell do you know all that? Chen demanded. Because I can feel it. Daniel nodded toward the primary flight display. And because your attitude indicator is showing a 2-degree discrepancy between Alpha and Bravo computers, which tells me your sensor fusion is already degraded. You're getting conflicting data, which means you're about to get conflicting commands. Another 5 minutes, and this aircraft won't be sure which way is up. Harmon's jaw worked. Who are you? Captain Daniel Brooks, United States Air Force, retired. Special Operations Command. I spent 15 years flying aircraft that had no business staying in the air, and I brought every single one of them home. He met the captain's eyes without flinching. You asked for combat experience. I've got more than anyone on this planet you're ever likely to meet. Now tell me what you need. The silence stretched. Harmon studied him, not his clothes, not his appearance, but his eyes. Looking for something, fear maybe, or uncertainty, or the telltale signs of a man who was bluffing. He didn't find any of those things. What he found was the absolute, unshakable calm of a man who had stared death in the face so many times that it had become just another variable to be calculated. You said you've landed aircraft with complete hydraulic failure, Harmon said slowly. Talk me through it. F-16 over Syria, 2014. Took shrapnel from a ground battery that severed my main hydraulic line. Lost primary and backup within 2 minutes. Daniel spoke without hesitation, without embellishment. Manual reversion in an F-16 means flying the aircraft through differential throttle and direct stick input. No power assistance, just muscle and feel. The control surfaces were stiff as concrete, but I made them move. Put her down at a forward operating base in Turkey with 6 inches of runway to spare. That's a fighter jet. This is an Airbus. The physics are the same, the techniques are different, but the principle holds. When the computers fail, the aircraft becomes an extension of your body. You feel what it's feeling. You react before you think. You make adjustments in fractions of degrees because that's the difference between life and death. He paused. I've also cross-trained on commercial emergency procedures. After I left the service, I work at an airport. Maintenance and operations. I've kept current on the theory, even if I haven't had my hands on a commercial flight deck in years. Harmon glanced at Chen. Something passed between them. A look, a decision, a leap of faith. Okay, Harmon said. Okay. Let's say I believe you. What would you do? Daniel stepped closer to the instrument panel, his eyes scanning the screens with clinical precision. First, I need to understand exactly how bad it is. Run me through your remaining systems. What do you have and what have you lost? For the next 3 minutes, Chen walked him through the cascade of failures. The unexplained loss of hydraulic fluid from all 3 systems, the degradation of the flight control computers, the increasing sluggishness of the control surfaces. With each piece of information, Daniel's expression grew more focused, more intent. You've got one option, he said finally. The aircraft's mechanical backup. It's a last resort system that allows direct manual input to the control surfaces, bypassing the computers entirely. It's not designed for normal flight. It's designed for exactly this situation. We know about mechanical backup, Chen said, but neither of us has ever actually used it outside a simulator. Neither have most pilots. It's a skill set that's almost never needed in commercial aviation. Daniel's voice was grim. But I've used it. Not in a simulator. In the air, with lives depending on it. It's brutal. It's exhausting. But it works. Can you do it? Harmon asked. If we get to that point, can you actually fly this aircraft in mechanical backup? Daniel met his eyes. Give me the seat. I'll get you on the ground. Another silence. Longer this time. Harmon was weighing the decision of his career, possibly the decision of his life. Trust a stranger. A man who had walked out of economy class with nothing but his word and his bearing with the lives of everyone on board. Or rely on his own skills and Chen's, knowing that neither of them had the experience to handle what was coming. It wasn't really a choice at all. Chen, Harmon said quietly. Give him your seat. Chen's head snapped toward his captain. Sir? You heard me? Move. For a moment it looked like Chen might argue. Then he saw something in Harmon's face, resignation, maybe, or something closer to hope, and he nodded slowly. He unstrapped his harness and rose from the first officer's seat. Daniel didn't hesitate. He slid into the chair with the fluid grace of a man returning to a place he'd never truly left, and his hands found the controls as naturally as breathing. It had been 10 years. It felt like 10 seconds. Okay, he said, wrapping his fingers around the side stick, feeling the subtle vibrations of the aircraft traveling up through the plastic and metal and into his palm. Let's see what we're working with. The plane shuddered again, and somewhere in the darkness below, the Atlantic Ocean waited. Daniel Brooks had spent 10 years running from the sky. Now, with 243 lives hanging in the balance, the sky had finally caught up with him, and he was ready. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in controlled chaos. Daniel absorbed information like a sponge, firing questions at Harmon with the rapid precision of a pilot who understood that every second mattered. Fuel state, weather at possible diversion airports, distance to the nearest suitable runway, aircraft weight, and center of gravity. He built a mental picture of their situation with ruthless efficiency, discarding options as fast as he considered them. Shannon was too far. Reykjavik was too far. They were in the middle of the Atlantic, equidistant from everywhere and close to nowhere, with an aircraft that was bleeding out faster than they could compensate. "Gander," Daniel said finally. "How far?" "About an hour at current speed," Harmon replied, "but we're not going to maintain current speed much longer. Every time we lose more control authority, we have to slow down to keep from overstressing the airframe." "Then we need to get there faster." Daniel's jaw set. "What's our maximum safe speed in the current degraded state?" 300 knots? Maybe 310. Beyond that, the airframe starts taking loads it wasn't designed for without full computer protection. "We'll risk 320. The sooner we're on the ground, the sooner we stop bleeding systems." "That could cause structural shakage?" "Captain." Daniel's voice cut through the objection like a knife. "I understand the risks. I also understand that we're running a race against physics, and physics doesn't care about our comfort level. We push now, or we don't have enough aircraft left to land when we get there. Your call." Harmon held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. 320 it is. I'll handle the coordination with Gander. You focus on keeping us in the air." "Roger that." As Harmon began his emergency communication with Gander ATC, Daniel turned his full attention to the aircraft. The Airbus A330 was a beautiful machine, elegant, efficient, designed to be as pilot-friendly as possible. But pilot-friendly assumed pilots were working with fully functional systems. What Daniel had to work with was something else entirely. He could feel the aircraft fighting against him. Every input he made was answered with a slight delay, a slight resistance, as the failing computers struggled to interpret his commands and translate them into coherent instructions. The side stick felt sluggish in his hand, the throttles unresponsive to fine adjustments. He was flying through a layer of electronic cotton, his instincts muffled by technology that was supposed to help but was now actively hindering. He would need to turn that technology off. Not yet. The computers were still providing some stability, still buying them time, but soon, when they finally lost all hydraulic power, when the flight control computers gave up entirely and dumped them into mechanical backup, he would be flying the aircraft raw. No buffers, no protection, just his hands and his feel and 25 years of experience that he'd tried so hard to forget. God, he had missed this. The thought surprised him, cutting through the analytical focus with a sharp edge of emotion. He was terrified. Of course he was terrified, only a fool wouldn't be. But beneath the fear was something else, something that felt disturbingly like joy. This was what he was made for. This was what he had trained for, what he had bled for, what he had sacrificed everything for. Not the management job, not the routine maintenance, not the safe and sensible life he'd built in the wreckage of his ambitions. This, the razor's edge between life and death, the absolute clarity of a moment where nothing mattered except skill and will and the stubborn refusal to let gravity win. He had buried the pilot to save the father, but the pilot had never really died. "Captain Brooks?" Harmon's voice pulled him back to the present. "Gander is ready for us. They're clearing all traffic, rolling every emergency vehicle they have. ETA at current speed is 43 minutes. We'll make it in 35, Daniel said. I'm going to start configuring for approach early. The more time we have to set up, the better chance we have of walking away from this." "What do you need from me?" "Talk to the cabin. Let them know we're diverting, but don't tell them how bad it is. We need calm passengers, not panicking ones. And get me someone from the crew who can strap in up here. If this gets as ugly as I think it might, I'm going to need another set of hands." Harmon nodded and reached for the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a technical issue, we will be diverting to Gander International Airport in Newfoundland. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. The flight crew will be coming through the cabin to ensure everyone is prepared for landing. We appreciate your patience and cooperation during this time. The announcement was calm, measured, professional. It said nothing about failing hydraulics, nothing about mechanical backup, nothing about the cold mathematics that gave them perhaps a 60% chance of survival. It was, Daniel reflected, a masterpiece of strategic omission. But it wouldn't fool everyone. Back in the cabin, the passengers who knew anything about aviation were already doing their own calculations. The diversion to Gander, a remote airport in the middle of Newfoundland that no one voluntarily flew to, told its own story. The urgency in the flight attendants' movements as they secured the cabin told another, and the faces of the crew told the rest. Daniel pushed those thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to think about the passengers now, the mothers and fathers, the children, the 243 individual stories that would either continue or end based on what happened in the next half hour. He had to focus on the aircraft, on the numbers, on the 1,000 small decisions that would add up to salvation or disaster. Meredith, he called over his shoulder to the flight attendant who had remained near the cockpit door, I need you to find me something. She stepped closer, her face tight with barely controlled fear. What do you need? A physical item, something personal. Something that matters to someone on this aircraft. He glanced at her. I know it sounds strange, but I need something to focus on. Something to remind me why I'm here. She stared at him for a moment, uncomprehending. Then her expression shifted and she nodded. Give me 2 minutes. She was back in 90 seconds. There's a little girl in row 12, Meredith said quietly. She's traveling alone, unaccompanied minor. She was clutching this when she boarded, and she hasn't let go of it the entire flight. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small stuffed elephant, gray and worn, with one ear slightly lopsided and a thread of red ribbon around its neck. Daniel took it carefully, as though it were made of glass. For a moment he was somewhere else. A hospital room 10 years ago, holding another stuffed animal. A rabbit, pink and perfect, while machines beeped and Aaliyah's hand grew cold in his. Maya had been in the nursery down the hall, too young to understand that her mother was never coming home, too innocent to know that the world had just become a darker and more dangerous place. He had promised himself then that he would never let anything happen to his daughter. He was keeping that promise now, not just for Maya, but for every child on this aircraft, for every parent who would be waiting at an arrival gate, watching and hoping, for every family that deserved a chance to stay whole. Daniel tucked the stuffed elephant into his shirt pocket, where he could feel its slight weight against his heart. Thank you, he said to Meredith. Now strap in. This is going to get rough. The final approach to Gander International Airport began 17 minutes later. By then, they had lost all hydraulic power. The flight control computers had failed completely, dumping them into mechanical backup mode with all the subtlety of a car losing power steering at highway speed. The side stick, which had been merely sluggish before, was now actively fighting Daniel's every input. The control surfaces, designed to be moved by powerful hydraulic actuators, were being operated by direct mechanical linkage and whatever muscle power Daniel could generate. His arms were already burning. His shoulders screamed with every correction. His hands, wrapped around the side stick with white-knuckled intensity, were beginning to cramp. But the aircraft was still flying. 10,000 feet, Harmon called out, his voice strained. He had taken over the role of talking Daniel through the approach, calling out altitudes and speeds and positions while Daniel focused entirely on keeping them in the air. Speed 240, looking good on the localizer. I need flaps, Daniel said through gritted teeth. 15 degrees. Flaps 15. Harmon moved the lever, but nothing happened. No response. Flaps are inoperative. Damn it! Daniel had expected this. The flaps, like everything else, were hydraulically operated, but the reality still hit hard. Without flaps, they would have to land at a much higher speed than normal. The runway at Gander was long, but it wasn't infinitely long, and they were going to be coming in fast and hot with limited braking ability. What's our landing speed without flaps? Harmon asked. 170, maybe 180. We'll need the entire runway plus whatever overrun they've got. Daniel's jaw tightened. Tell them to foam the runway if they haven't already, and make sure the emergency crews are ready for a hard stop. Roger. The next 5 minutes were the longest of Daniel's life. He nursed the crippled aircraft through the descent, fighting for every degree of bank, every foot of altitude correction. The A330 felt like a wounded animal under his hands, reluctant, unpredictable, ready to betray him at the slightest provocation. He talked to it constantly, a low murmur of encouragement and command that only he could hear. "Come on, sweetheart. Stay with me. I know you're tired. I know you're hurting, but we're almost there. Just a little bit farther." The runway appeared through the darkness, a blazing ribbon of lights cutting through the Canadian wilderness. "Runway in sight," Daniel announced. "I have the field." "You're cleared to land, runway 22, Harmon relayed from his communication with the tower. "All emergency services standing by. Godspeed." Daniel didn't respond. His entire world had narrowed to the rectangle of lights ahead, to the numbers crawling across the altimeter, to the feel of the aircraft shuddering and groaning beneath him. Everything else had ceased to exist. 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet, 500 feet. The ground rushed up to meet them, impossibly fast, impossibly real. Daniel pulled back on the stick, fighting against forces that no human body was designed to overcome, trying to arrest the rate of descent without stalling the aircraft. The wheels touched. The impact was brutal. Far harder than any landing Daniel had ever made, harder than anything the passengers had ever experienced. The aircraft slammed onto the runway with a screech of tortured tires, bounced once, twice, then settled with a shudder that ran through the entire fuselage. "Reversers," Daniel shouted, but he already knew it was useless. The thrust reversers, like everything else, were hydraulically operated. They had nothing but brakes, and the brakes were fading fast as what little hydraulic pressure remained in the accumulators bled away. The end of the runway was approaching. The aircraft was still doing 100 knots. Daniel made a decision. He slammed his foot onto the left rudder pedal, using the last of his control authority to throw the aircraft into a controlled skid. The tires screamed. The airframe groaned. Passengers in the cabin were thrown against their seatbelts as the world tilted and spun. The aircraft slewed sideways across the runway, trading forward momentum for lateral stress, bleeding speed in the most violent way possible. The right wingtip scraped against the ground, throwing up a shower of sparks. The nose gear collapsed. And then, impossibly, miraculously, the aircraft stopped. It came to rest at a 30-degree angle to the runway, its nose buried in the grass of the overrun area, its wings intact, its fuselage unbroken. Emergency vehicles were already racing toward it, lights flashing, sirens wailing. For a long moment, there was absolute silence in the cockpit. Then Harmon let out a breath that he seemed to have been holding for the past hour. "We're down," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We're on the ground." Daniel released the side stick. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely uncurl his fingers. His arms felt like they'd been filled with lead. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. But they were alive. 243 souls had just cheated death, and he had been the one to pull off the magic trick. In the cabin behind him, the silence was breaking into chaos, screams and sobs and prayers, and the hysterical laughter of people who had just realized they weren't going to die. Flight attendants were shouting instructions, opening emergency exits, deploying slides, beginning the evacuation that training and instinct demanded. Daniel didn't move. He sat in the first officer's seat, staring through the shattered windscreen at the foam-covered runway and the flashing lights, and the gray dawn breaking over the Newfoundland wilderness, and he felt something crack open inside him. 10 years. He had spent 10 years running from this, from the fear, from the responsibility, from the weight of lives depending on his hands. He had convinced himself that he could be someone else, that he could bury the pilot and become just a father, just an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But ordinary men don't save 243 people at 37,000 feet. And the pilot, it turned out, had never been buried at all. He had just been waiting. Daniel reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the small stuffed elephant. It was slightly damp with his sweat, its gray fur darkened where it had pressed against his chest through the ordeal. He looked at it for a long moment, this small, insignificant thing that had somehow become the anchor that held him together when everything else was falling apart. Then he unstrapped his harness and stood. His legs nearly buckled, but he caught himself on the center console. Harmon was watching him with an expression that Daniel couldn't quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but something else too. something that might have been awe. "Captain Brooks," Harmon said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Daniel's voice was hoarse. "We've got 243 passengers who need to get off this aircraft safely. The job's not done until the last one is on the ground." He moved toward the cockpit door, toward the chaos of the cabin beyond, toward the work that still needed to be done. But before he stepped through, he paused and looked back at Harmon. "The little girl in row 12, he said. "The unaccompanied minor. Make sure she's first off the aircraft, and give her back her elephant." He pressed the stuffed animal into Harmon's hand. Then Daniel Brooks, father, pilot, survivor, walked out to finish what he'd started. The evacuation took 47 minutes. 47 minutes of controlled chaos, of flight attendants shouting instructions over the wail of emergency sirens, of passengers stumbling down inflatable slides into the arms of rescue workers, of children crying and adults praying, and the steady stream of humanity pouring out of an aircraft that had no business still being intact. Daniel worked alongside the crew through every second of it. He helped elderly passengers navigate the debris-strewn aisle. He carried a woman with a broken ankle to the nearest exit. He calmed a teenager who had frozen at the top of the emergency slide, too terrified to jump, by taking her hand and going down with her. He did the work because the work needed to be done, because he couldn't stand still while others struggled, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean feeling, and he wasn't ready to feel anything yet. The little girl from row 12, her name was Sophie, he learned, and she was 8 years old, flying alone to meet her grandmother in Toronto, was evacuated first, just as he'd requested. Harmon had personally escorted her to the forward exit, pressing the stuffed elephant into her trembling hands with a gentleness that belied his exhaustion. Daniel watched from across the cabin as Sophie clutched the worn gray toy to her chest and disappeared down the slide, and something in him loosened just slightly. One child safe. Now 242 more to go. By the time the last passenger had been evacuated, a businessman who had insisted on retrieving his laptop from the overhead bin and had to be physically removed by airport security. The sun had fully risen over Gander. The October morning was cold and sharp, the kind of Canadian autumn chill that cut through clothing and settled into bones, but Daniel barely noticed. He was standing at the base of the emergency slide, watching the ambulances and buses ferry passengers to the terminal when Harmon appeared beside him. "Everyone's accounted for," the captain said. "Minor injuries only. Some bruises, a few sprains, one possible concussion from the landing impact. But everyone's alive." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle between them. "Everyone's alive because of you." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the aircraft, his aircraft, in a way that felt both wrong and inevitable, taking in the damage for the first time from the outside. The nose was buried 3 feet deep in the grass of the overrun area. The right wingtip had been sheared off completely, leaving a jagged scar of exposed metal. The landing gear had collapsed asymmetrically, giving the fuselage a drunken tilt that would have been comical if it weren't so terrifying. They should not have survived that landing. By every reasonable calculation, by every principle of physics and engineering and probability, they should be scattered across a debris field right now. The aircraft should have cartwheeled when the wingtip struck. The fuselage should have broken apart when the nose gear collapsed. The fuel tank should have ruptured. The fire should have spread, and 243 families should be receiving the worst phone calls of their lives. But none of that had happened. Instead, 243 people were standing in a Canadian airport terminal, shaken and traumatized but breathing, their hearts still beating, their futures still intact. Because of him. Because Daniel Brooks, invisible passenger in seat 8A, had chosen to stand up when everything in him had screamed to stay down. "I need to make a phone call," he said finally, his voice rough with exhaustion. Harmon nodded. "Of course. Whatever you need. The airport authorities will want to speak with you. There'll be an investigation, obviously. The NTSB will be involved. But that can wait. Take whatever time you need." Daniel walked away from the aircraft, away from the controlled chaos of the emergency response, toward a quiet corner of the tarmac where the morning sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered grass. His hands were still shaking as he pulled out his phone, and it took him 3 tries to unlock the screen. The contact photo that greeted him was Maya's face, captured mid-laugh at her 6th birthday party, chocolate frosting smeared across her cheek. He stared at it for a long moment, letting the image fill his vision, letting it push out everything else. The fear, the exhaustion, the terrible weight of what he'd just done. Then he pressed call. The phone rang twice before his sister answered. "Daniel?" Denise's voice was thick with sleep. "It's 6 in the morning. Is everything okay? Is Maya there?" "She's asleep." "Daniel, what's going on? You sound... Wake her up." The words came out harder than he'd intended, sharp-edged with emotion he couldn't quite control. "Please, Denise. I need to hear her voice." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then softly. "Okay. Hold on." He heard movement. Denise getting out of bed, walking down the hallway, opening a door. Then a small, sleepy voice that hit him like a physical blow. "Daddy?" Daniel closed his eyes. The world tilted around him, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he was going to laugh or cry or collapse right there on the frozen Canadian tarmac. "Hey, baby girl." His voice cracked on the words. "I'm sorry to wake you up." "It's okay." Maya yawned. "Are you still on the airplane?" "No, sweetheart. I'm on the ground now." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I just wanted to hear your voice. I wanted to tell you that I love you." "I love you too, Daddy." Another yawn. "Did you bring me chocolate?" A laugh escaped him, raw and broken and genuine. "I did. I have a whole bag of British chocolate waiting for you. I'll be home soon, okay? I promise." "Okay, can I go back to sleep now?" "Yeah, baby, you can go back to sleep. I'll see you soon." "Bye, Daddy." "Bye, Maya." The line went dead and Daniel stood there for a long moment, the phone pressed against his ear, listening to nothing. The weight of the past few hours crashed over him like a wave. The terror, the focus, the impossible precision of what he'd accomplished. And he let himself feel it for the first time. Let himself acknowledge how close he'd come to never hearing that sleepy voice again. He was still standing there when someone called his name. "Mr. Brooks?" Daniel turned to find a woman approaching across the tarmac. She was in her 40s, wearing a sharp navy suit that marked her as something other than emergency personnel. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, extending her hand. "Transportation Safety Board of Canada. I've been assigned as lead investigator for this incident." Daniel shook her hand automatically. "Already? It's been less than an hour. An aircraft with complete hydraulic failure that still manages to land with no fatalities? That's not something that happens every day, Mr. Brooks." Her eyes swept over him, taking in his rumpled clothes, his exhausted face, his shaking hands. Or should I say Captain Brooks? "I'm not a captain anymore. Haven't been for 10 years. And yet here we are." She gestured toward the terminal building. "I'd like to ask you some questions, if you don't mind. Nothing formal yet. We'll need to do proper depositions later, but I'm trying to understand what happened up there." Daniel nodded slowly. He supposed he'd known this was coming. The anonymity he'd clung to for a decade was about to be stripped away, one question at a time. "Lead the way," he said. They set up in a small conference room in the airport's administrative wing, away from the chaos of the main terminal where the passengers were being processed and interviewed. Someone had brought coffee, strong and black and exactly what Daniel needed, and he wrapped his hands around the cup like a lifeline as Sarah Chen settled across from him with a tablet and a recording device. "For the record," she began, "please state your full name and relevant qualifications." "Daniel James Brooks. Former Captain, United States Air Force. I served with the 1st Special Operations Wing at Hurlburt Field, Florida from 2003 to 2015. My ratings included F-16C, D, A-10C, and MH-60G Pavehawk. I accumulated approximately 4,000 hours of combat flight time across multiple theaters of operation." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. 4,000 hours of combat time? That's exceptional. "I spent a lot of time in places that don't appear on maps." She made a note on her tablet. "And since leaving the military?" "I've been working as a maintenance supervisor at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. I keep current on aviation regulations and emergency procedures as part of my job, but I haven't actively flown since my discharge. Until tonight." "Until tonight?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Walk me through it." from the moment you realized something was wrong. Daniel took a long sip of coffee, organizing his thoughts. Then he began to talk. He described feeling the aircraft's subtle wrongness even before the announcement, the instincts that had never quite gone to sleep despite 10 years of trying to bury them. He described the initial volunteer, Gregory Patterson, the retired airline CEO, and his immediate assessment that the man lacked the necessary experience. He described his own hesitation, the war between the pilot he'd been and the father he'd become, and the moment when the memory of Maya had made the decision for him. The crew was skeptical when they first saw me, he admitted. I can't blame them. I didn't look like anyone's idea of a hero. But they let you help anyway. I didn't give them much choice. I walked into that cockpit knowing more about their situation than they did. When someone demonstrates expertise under pressure, questions about credentials tend to fade into the background. Sarah nodded slowly. The flight recorder data is still being processed, but the preliminary analysis is remarkable. The maneuvers you executed in mechanical backup mode, there's no textbook for what you did up there. There's no textbook for most of what I did in the Air Force either. Daniel set down his coffee cup. Combat flying teaches you to improvise. You can't always rely on systems and procedures when someone's shooting at you. You learn to feel the aircraft, to anticipate its behavior, to push it beyond the limits that the manual says are possible. And the landing. Daniel was quiet for a moment. The landing. The memory of those final seconds, the wheels slamming into concrete, the desperate skid, the wingtip scraping sparks across the runway, was still too raw, too immediate. The landing was ugly, he said finally. I made choices that will probably give your engineers nightmares for years. I deliberately induced asymmetric drag to bleed off speed because we had no braking authority. I sacrificed the wingtip to prevent a cartwheel. I used techniques that no commercial pilot would ever consider because commercial pilots are trained to trust their systems, and I had no systems left to trust. You saved 243 lives. I did what needed to be done. He met her eyes. I'm not looking for recognition, Ms. Chen. I'm not looking for praise or medals or book deals. I just want to get home to my daughter. Sarah held his gaze for a long moment. Then she smiled, the first genuine emotion she'd shown since they'd sat down. I'm afraid that's going to be complicated, she said. You're about to become a very famous man, Captain Brooks, whether you want to be or not. The prophecy began to fulfill itself within the hour. Daniel had assumed, naively, that the chaos of the emergency response would buy him time, that in the scramble to process passengers and coordinate with authorities, his role in the landing might remain a footnote rather than a headline. But he'd underestimated the speed at which information travels in the modern world, and he definitely underestimated the appetite of a 24-hour news cycle hungry for exactly the kind of story he represented. The first reporter found him in the terminal cafeteria, where he'd retreated after his interview with Sarah Chen to find something more substantial than coffee. She was young, probably mid-20s, with hungry eyes and a smartphone already recording. Mr. Brooks? I'm Amanda Torres with CBC News. I was hoping you could tell me about what happened on Flight 447. Daniel set down his sandwich. How did you know my name? One of the passengers posted on social media. They said there was a man from economy class who came forward to help fly the plane. The flight crew confirmed it was you. I'd prefer not to comment right now. The passengers are calling you a hero. They're saying you saved their lives when no one else could. How does that make you feel? How did it make him feel? Daniel looked at the young reporter, at her eager expression and her recording smartphone, and he felt a profound weariness settle over him. This was only the beginning. He knew it with a certainty born of long experience. The questions would multiply. The cameras would follow. His face would be everywhere: television, newspapers, social media, the whole chaotic machinery of modern fame, and Maya would see it. Maya would know. I was a passenger on an aircraft that experienced mechanical failure, he said carefully. I had relevant experience that allowed me to assist the flight crew. That's all. But you're not just a passenger, are you? You're a decorated Air Force combat pilot. You served in special operations. You have a Silver Star and a Distinguished Flying Cross. Daniel's jaw tightened. Someone had been talking. Someone had accessed records they shouldn't have access to. That's correct, he said. Why did you leave the military? Why was a pilot with your experience flying economy class on a transatlantic flight? I have a daughter. I wanted to be present for her childhood. He stood, abandoning the rest of his sandwich. I'm not going to answer any more questions right now. Please respect my privacy. He walked away before she could respond, but he could feel her eyes following him. He could feel everyone's eyes following him. The passengers who'd been processed and were waiting for connecting flights had begun to recognize him, pointing and whispering, some pulling out their phones to capture photos and video. The invisible man was invisible no more. He found a quiet corner near a window overlooking the tarmac and called Denise again. Daniel? His sister's voice was sharp with concern. I've been trying to reach you. There are reporters calling the house. Someone knocked on the door 20 minutes ago asking about you. What is going on? He closed his eyes. Turn on the news. A pause, then, oh my God, Daniel, is that your plane? Yes. It says here that a passenger helped land the aircraft after the pilots lost control, that the plane was going to crash, but someone... She stopped. Daniel, was that you? Yes. Oh my God. He heard her breath catch. Oh my God, are you okay? Are you hurt? I'm fine. Tired, but fine. He pressed his palm against the cold glass of the window. Listen, Denise, I need you to do something for me. I need you to keep Maya away from the television, away from the news. She doesn't need to see any of this. Daniel, she's going to find out eventually. Her father is on every channel right now. They're calling you a hero. I don't want her to find out from the news. I want to tell her myself in my own way when I get home. He took a breath. Can you do that for me? I'll try. Denise's voice softened. Daniel, are you really okay? You sound, I don't know, you sound different. Different, that was one word for it. He didn't know how to explain to his sister what it felt like to have your entire carefully constructed life shattered in the space of a few hours. To have the identity you'd buried come clawing back up from the grave, demanding recognition. I'll be home as soon as I can, he said. Probably tomorrow morning. The investigators want me to stick around for preliminary debriefing. Okay, I'll keep Maya safe, I promise. Thank you, Denise. I love you. I love you too. And Daniel? She paused. I'm proud of you. Mom and Dad would have been proud of you too. The words hit him harder than he'd expected. His parents had both passed years ago, his father to a heart attack, his mother to cancer, and they'd never gotten to see Maya grow up. But they'd seen him become a pilot. They'd been there when he earned his wings, when he received his first commendation, when he came home from deployments they weren't allowed to know about with shadows in his eyes and medals on his chest. They would have understood why he'd walked away. And they would have understood why, when it mattered most, he'd come back. I'll see you soon, he said, and ended the call. The next several hours passed in a blur of interviews, statements, and paperwork. Daniel spoke with the TSB again, then with representatives from the airline, then with officials from the FAA who had flown up from the States to participate in the investigation. He told the same story over and over, answered the same questions, walked through the same sequence of events, until the words felt like they were being spoken by someone else. Throughout it all, his phone buzzed constantly. Messages from numbers he didn't recognize, voicemails from journalists, television producers, book agents, people claiming to represent everything from major networks to documentary filmmakers. His inbox filled with interview requests, appearance offers, opportunities to tell his story to the world. He ignored all of it. What he couldn't ignore was the growing crowd outside the airport. Word had spread, apparently, that the hero of Flight 447 was still inside, and people had begun to gather, some out of curiosity, some hoping to catch a glimpse, some carrying signs and banners with messages of gratitude. By late afternoon, when Daniel finally had a moment to look out a window, the crowd had swelled to several hundred. They were calling his name. Daniel Brooks! Daniel Brooks! A chant, rhythmic and insistent, rising and falling like waves against the terminal walls. He stood at the window and watched them, these strangers who had come to celebrate him, and felt the strange disconnection of witnessing his own transformation into symbol. He wasn't the man they were cheering for. That man was a construction, a narrative, a hero shaped by headlines and hashtags. Daniel Brooks, the real Daniel Brooks, the tired father who missed his daughter and wanted nothing more than a hot shower and a quiet room, existed somewhere beneath that image, increasingly invisible, The irony wasn't lost on him. It was early evening when Captain Harmon found him. The airline captain looked almost as exhausted as Daniel felt, his uniform wrinkled and his face showing every one of his 58 years. But there was something else in his expression too, a weight that Daniel recognized. "Got a minute?" Harmon asked. Daniel nodded, and they walked together to a quiet corner of the terminal, away from the chaos. "I want to apologize," Harmon said. "For what?" "For doubting you." The older man ran a hand through his graying hair. "When you first came into the cockpit, I looked at you and I made assumptions. You weren't what I expected. You weren't what I was hoping for. And for a moment, just a moment, I almost dismissed you." "I know." Daniel's voice was quiet. "I saw it. And you helped anyway. You saved my passengers, my crew, my aircraft." Harmon's voice cracked slightly. "You saved my life, even though I looked at you like you couldn't possibly be what you claimed to be." "Captain Harmon." "Richard, please." "Richard." Daniel met the older man's eyes. "I've spent my entire life dealing with people who look at me and make assumptions. In the military, in the civilian world, in airports and restaurants and hotels. You learn to either fight it or ignore it. Tonight, I chose to ignore it because there wasn't time for anything else. That doesn't excuse what I did." "No, it doesn't." Daniel paused. "But I also understand. You were terrified. Your aircraft was failing, your passengers were in danger, and a stranger walked into your cockpit claiming to have answers. In that situation, skepticism isn't just reasonable, it's necessary. What matters is that you listened. You gave me a chance to prove myself. That's more than a lot of people in your position would have done." Harmon was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. "The little girl," he said. "Sophie. She made it to her grandmother in Toronto. They put her on another flight once she was cleared medically." He held out his hand. In his palm was the stuffed elephant. "Her grandmother called the airline to thank us. She asked us to return this to you. She said Sophie told her that the elephant kept the nice man strong enough to fly the plane." Daniel took the small toy. The gray fur was still slightly damp, still darkened where it had pressed against his chest. Such a small thing. Such an insignificant thing. Such a powerful thing. "Captain Brooks?" "Daniel." Harmon's voice was rough with emotion. "I've been flying for 30 years. I've seen a lot of skilled pilots, a lot of brave actions, a lot of professional excellence. What you did tonight was beyond all of that. What you did tonight was a miracle." "It wasn't a miracle." Daniel tucked the elephant into his pocket. "It was training, experience, a lifetime of learning how to keep machines in the air when they don't want to fly." "Maybe." Harmon extended his hand. "But I still think miracles need someone willing to perform them. Thank you for being willing." Daniel shook his hand. "Take care of yourself, Richard, and maybe consider taking some time off. The nightmares from this one are going to be significant." Harmon laughed, a short, sharp sound that held more grief than humor. "Already planning on it. My wife has been on the phone every hour since we landed. She's threatening to never let me fly again. Smart woman. The smartest." Harmon smiled. "Go home to your daughter, Captain Brooks. You've earned it." Daniel didn't correct him on the title. Tonight, he'd been a captain again. Maybe he always had been. The airline arranged for him to be smuggled out through a service entrance, away from the growing crowd and the waiting media. A private car took him to a hotel near the airport, where a room had been booked under a false name. The airline was covering everything: meals, accommodations, transportation back to New York, and they'd promised to have him on a flight home by morning. The room was simple but clean, with a bed that looked like heaven, and a shower that Daniel stood under for nearly 30 minutes, letting the hot water wash away the sweat and tension and accumulated terror of the past 12 hours. When he finally emerged, his skin pink and his muscles loose for the first time since the ordeal began, he felt almost human again. He ordered room service, a steak, medium rare, with a baked potato and a side salad, and ate it sitting on the bed in a hotel bathrobe, watching the muted television coverage of the event he'd just lived through. The footage was dramatic. Shaky cell phone videos of the damaged aircraft on the runway, interviews with tearful passengers, aerial shots from news helicopters showing the full extent of the destruction. And then there was his picture. Someone had pulled his military photo, the official portrait from his last year of active duty, clean-shaven and serious in his dress blues, the ribbons and medals on his chest telling a story of valor and sacrifice. The image was everywhere, plastered across every network, the face of the hero of Flight 447. Daniel stared at the man in that photograph and barely recognized him. 10 years. 10 years of civilian life, of changing diapers and making lunches and helping with homework. 10 years of trying to be ordinary, trying to forget the person he'd been, trying to build a life that didn't require him to be exceptional. And now this. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He let it go to voicemail like all the others, but this time, something made him listen to the message. A woman's voice, professional but warm. "Mr. Brooks, my name is Patricia Hayes. I'm the executive producer of Morning America. We'd like to offer you an exclusive interview to tell your story. We're prepared to provide substantial compensation, and we can guarantee editorial control over how your narrative is presented. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." Morning America. The compensation would be significant. He had no doubt of that. Enough to pay for Maya's college, maybe. Enough to buy a house, to build a real life, to give his daughter everything she deserved. All he had to do was become public property. Daniel deleted the message. Then he deleted the next one, and the next after that. He deleted every voicemail from every producer and journalist and opportunist who saw his name as a ticket to ratings. He cleared his inbox of interview requests and appearance offers. He blocked every unknown number that tried to call. By the time he was done, his phone was blessedly silent. He turned off the television, closed the curtains, and lay down on the hotel bed. His body was exhausted, but his mind continued to race, replaying the events of the night in an endless loop. The feel of the side stick in his hand, the scream of the engines, the moment of impact when the wheels had struck the runway with world-ending force, the silence that had followed, the silence that had meant they were alive. He thought about Maya, asleep in Denise's apartment, unaware that her father had just performed the impossible. He thought about the promise he'd made to himself at Aaliyah's funeral, to always be there, to never again choose the sky over his daughter. Had he broken that promise tonight? Or had he kept it in a way he'd never imagined possible? The questions chased each other through his exhausted mind, and somewhere in the middle of them, Daniel Brooks finally fell asleep. He dreamed of flying, not the desperate, terrifying flying of the last 12 hours, but the flying of his youth, the pure, joyful soaring that had made him fall in love with the sky in the first place. He was in the cockpit of an F-16, alone above the clouds, the sun blazing on the horizon, and the earth a distant memory beneath him. There was no mission, no objective, no lives depending on his performance. There was only flight. In the dream, he could feel Aaliyah beside him. Not physically present, she'd never been in a cockpit with him, but there in spirit, her warmth and love surrounding him like the atmosphere itself. "You were always meant for this," she seemed to say. "You were always meant to soar." "But I chose you," he answered. "I chose Maya. I chose the ground." The dream Aaliyah laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "You didn't choose the ground, baby. You just chose a different kind of sky." He woke with her name on his lips and tears on his cheeks. The hotel room was dark, the curtains still drawn against the world outside. His phone showed 3:47 a.m. He'd been asleep for 5 hours, and he felt like he could sleep for 5 more, but the dream had left him unsettled, raw, too close to emotions he'd spent years trying to bury. He got up and opened the curtains. Gander at night was not an impressive sight. A small Canadian airport town, mostly asleep at this hour, its lights scattered across the darkness like fallen stars. But beyond the town, beyond the lights, Daniel could see the sky. Clear and cold and vast, stretching forever in every direction. The same sky he'd fallen through tonight, the same sky he'd conquered. He pressed his palm against the cold glass and let himself remember. Not the terror, not the desperate calculations and split-second decisions. He let himself remember what it had felt like to fly again. To have the aircraft responding to his touch, to feel the subtle vibrations of a machine surrendering to his will, to be, for a few miraculous hours, the pilot he'd once been. It had felt like coming home. and that scared him more than any hydraulic failure ever could. The flight back to New York left at 8 in the morning. Daniel arrived at the airport with an hour to spare, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses in a futile attempt at disguise. It didn't work. The gate agents recognized him immediately, and within minutes other passengers were pointing and whispering. But this time, something had changed. The stares weren't skeptical, they weren't dismissive. The people looking at him now looked at him with something he'd rarely experienced in his civilian life: respect. A woman approached him as he waited to board. She was middle-aged, well-dressed, holding the hand of a young boy who couldn't have been more than 6. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you Captain Brooks?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "I was on the flight last night, seat 23C. Tears began to stream down her face. "This is my grandson, Michael. We were flying to New York to meet his parents for his birthday. When the announcement came, when we started falling, I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm glad you're safe," Daniel said quietly. "You saved us." She reached out and took his hand, clutching it with both of hers. "You saved my grandson's life. I don't know how to thank you. I don't know if there are words." Daniel looked down at the little boy, who was staring up at him with wide, curious eyes, the same age as Maya, the same innocent wonder. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Just take care of him. That's all any of us can do, take care of the ones we love." The woman nodded, tears still falling, and led her grandson away. Daniel watched them go and felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't quite name. The flight to New York was uneventful, a word Daniel had never appreciated more. He sat in first class, the airline had insisted, accepted a glass of orange juice, and spent most of the 2-hour journey staring out the window at clouds that looked peaceful and harmless, as though the sky itself had decided to apologize for the night before. When the plane touched down at JFK, Daniel felt the impact in his bones. Not because it was rough, it was one of the smoothest landings he'd ever experienced, but because it meant he was home. The journey was over. The nightmare was behind him. Now came the hard part. Denise was waiting for him at the arrivals gate, Maya holding her hand. He saw them before they saw him, his sister's familiar face lined with worry and relief in equal measure, and Maya's small form, bouncing impatiently as she scanned the crowd for her father. She was wearing her favorite purple dress, the one Aaliyah had bought her before she died, and her hair was in 2 perfect braids that Denise had clearly spent an hour perfecting. Then Maya spotted him. "Daddy!" The word cut through the noise of the airport like a knife, and suddenly she was running, her little legs pumping, her braids flying behind her. Daniel dropped to his knees just in time to catch her as she launched herself into his arms. "Daddy! Daddy! Daddy!" She was laughing and crying at the same time, her small arms wrapped around his neck with surprising strength. "You were gone so long. Aunt Denise said there was a problem with your airplane. I was worried." "I know, baby." Daniel held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling the warmth of her small body against his chest. "I know, but I'm home now. I'm here. Did you bring me chocolate?" He laughed, the first real laugh he'd had since this whole ordeal began. "Yes, baby, I brought you chocolate." "Yay!" She pulled back to look at him, her dark eyes, Aaliyah's eyes, studying his face with sudden seriousness. "Daddy, you look tired." "I am tired, sweetheart. I had a very long night." "Aunt Denise said you were a hero." Maya's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "She said you flew an airplane and saved everybody. Is that true?" Daniel glanced up at Denise, who stood a few feet away with tears streaming down her face. So much for keeping Maya away from the news. "It's true," he said. "There was a problem with the airplane, and I helped the pilots fix it." Maya's eyes went wide. "Like a superhero?" "Not like a superhero, just like your daddy." Maya seemed to consider this for a moment. Then she nodded with the sage wisdom of a 7-year-old. "That's better," she said. "Superheroes aren't real, but you're real, and you're my daddy, so that means you're the best hero of all." Daniel pulled her close again, hiding his face in her hair so she wouldn't see the tears that had begun to fall. "Yeah, baby," he whispered. "That's exactly what it means." Denise drove them home, navigating through traffic that seemed lighter than usual, the morning sun warming the car's interior. Maya chattered the entire way, about school, about her friend Emma's birthday party, about the dream she'd had where unicorns could fly, but only if you sang them a special song. And Daniel listened to every word like it was music. This was why he'd done it. This was why he'd stood up when everything in him screamed to stay down. Not for glory, not for recognition, not to prove anything to anyone. For this, for her, for the chance to sit in a car and listen to his daughter's voice, to watch the sun catch the sparkle in her eyes, to know that he would be there for every birthday, and every scraped knee, and every nightmare, and every triumph, every moment that mattered. He had flown the impossible flight. But this ordinary, beautiful, mundane morning was the real victory. When they arrived at the apartment, there was a crowd outside. Daniel's heart sank. Reporters, photographers, people with cameras and microphones, all clustered on the sidewalk in front of his building. They spotted the car immediately, surging forward like a wave. "Denise," he said quietly, "drive around back. There's a service entrance." She nodded, her jaw tight, and navigated through the alley behind the building. They made it to the underground parking garage without being followed, and Daniel hustled Maya into the elevator before anyone could catch up. "Why were those people outside?" Maya asked as the elevator rose. "They want to talk to Daddy about what happened on the airplane." "Are you going to talk to them?" Daniel looked down at his daughter, at her innocent face and curious eyes. She deserved an honest answer. "I don't know, sweetheart. I haven't decided yet." The apartment was exactly as he'd left it. Dishes in the sink, Maya's toys scattered across the living room, the faint smell of coffee from the pot he'd forgotten to turn off. Home. Messy and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment, just taking it in. "Daddy?" Maya tugged at his hand. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay, baby." He squeezed her fingers. "I'm just happy to be home." Denise had followed them up, and now she stood in the kitchen, making a fresh pot of coffee with the practiced ease of someone who had spent too many nights worrying. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups and sat down across from Daniel at the small kitchen table. Maya had retreated to her room to play, and for a moment the apartment was quiet. "Tell me," Denise said softly. "Tell me what really happened." So he told her. Not the sanitized version he'd given the investigators, not the careful narrative he'd crafted for official consumption. He told her the truth, the terror and the doubt, the moment when he'd almost stayed in his seat, the war between the pilot and the father that had raged inside him at 37,000 feet. He told her about the stuffed elephant, about Sophie, the little girl traveling alone, about the way he'd tucked that small gray toy into his pocket and let it anchor him through the worst moments of his life. He told her about the landing, the brutal, impossible landing that had shattered the aircraft but saved everyone on board. And he told her about the dream, about Aaliyah's voice in his ear, telling him that he hadn't chosen the ground, just a different kind of sky. When he finished, Denise was crying again. "She would be so proud of you," she said. "Aaliyah, she always knew who you really were, even when you tried to hide it." "I didn't hide it for her. I hid it for Maya." "I know." Denise reached across the table and took his hand. "But maybe it's time to stop hiding. Maybe it's time to let your daughter see who her father really is." Daniel looked toward Maya's room, where he could hear her singing softly to herself, some song from a movie she'd watched at Emma's house, the words half remembered and half invented. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe it is." That evening, after Maya had eaten her dinner and taken her bath and been tucked into bed with the promised British chocolate already half devoured, Daniel sat alone in the darkened living room. The television was off. His phone was off. The world outside, with all its reporters and cameras and demands, felt very far away. He thought about the people he'd saved. 243 souls, each with their own stories, their own families, their own reasons to live. They were scattered across the country now, returning to their lives, holding their loved ones a little tighter than before. He thought about Richard Harmon, the captain who had doubted him and then trusted him with everything. He hoped the man was sleeping, hoped the nightmares wouldn't be too severe. He thought about Sophie and her grandmother in Toronto, about Michael and his grandmother who'd wept with gratitude at the gate, and he thought about Aaliyah. "I did it. He whispered into the darkness. I kept our baby safe. I kept my promise. The silence that answered him was vast and empty and somehow comforting. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed. The city was still moving, still breathing, still alive. Daniel Brooks closed his eyes and let the exhaustion finally take him. Tomorrow, there would be decisions to make, interviews to decline or accept, a public identity to navigate, a daughter to raise with a new understanding of who her father was and what he was capable of. Tomorrow, the world would demand answers. But tonight, in this quiet apartment, with his daughter sleeping safely down the hall, Daniel allowed himself to simply exist. Not as a hero, not as a symbol, not as the man who had saved Flight 447, just as a father, just as himself. And for the first time in 10 years, that felt like enough. The peace lasted exactly 37 hours. Daniel woke on the second morning home to the sound of Maya's laughter mixing with the buzz of his doorbell, both sounds piercing through the fog of exhaustion that still clung to him like a second skin. He stumbled out of bed, pulled on a t-shirt, and made his way to the living room just in time to see Denise opening the front door to reveal a delivery man buried behind an avalanche of flower arrangements. Daniel Brooks? The man asked, peering around a massive bouquet of roses. That's me. Got about 15 more of these downstairs. Where do you want them? By noon, the apartment looked like a florist shop had exploded inside it. Flowers covered every surface, roses and lilies and orchids and arrangements Daniel couldn't even name, each one accompanied by a card expressing gratitude, admiration, or some variation of thank you for saving my life. The messages came from passengers, from their families, from complete strangers who had watched the news coverage and felt compelled to reach out. Mixed among the flowers were other gifts, stuffed animals for Maya, bottles of expensive wine, gift baskets filled with gourmet food. One package contained a hand-knitted blanket with a card that read, My grandmother was on Flight 447. She's 87 years old and she wants you to know she's not done living yet. Thank you for giving her more time. Daniel held that card for a long moment, reading it over and over until the words blurred. Daddy, can I keep this one? Maya appeared at his elbow, clutching a stuffed elephant that someone had sent, gray and soft, remarkably similar to the one that had anchored him through the landing. It looks like the elephant from your story. He had told her the story the night before. Not all of it. She was too young for the terror, the desperation, the moments when he genuinely believed they were all going to die. But enough. He'd told her about the little girl named Sophie who was traveling alone, about the stuffed elephant that had given him strength, about how thinking of Maya had helped him find the courage to stand up when he wanted to stay hidden. She had listened with wide eyes, asking questions he hadn't anticipated. Were you scared, Daddy? Yes, baby. I was scared. Did the airplane hurt when it landed? The airplane got hurt so the people inside wouldn't. Are you still a pilot? I don't know, sweetheart. I don't know. Now she stood before him with the stuffed elephant, waiting for permission to keep a reminder of the night her father had become someone different. Of course you can keep it, he said. Every hero needs an elephant. Maya beamed and ran off to show her new treasure to Denise, leaving Daniel alone with the mountain of gratitude that had invaded his home. His phone, which he had turned back on out of necessity, buzzed constantly. He'd stopped counting the interview requests after the first 100. Morning shows, evening shows, podcasts, documentaries, book publishers, movie studios. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, a piece of him. The numbers they were offering had grown increasingly absurd. 6 figures for an exclusive interview, 7 figures for book rights, enough money to secure Maya's future 10 times over. He hadn't said yes to any of them, but he hadn't said no either. The knock on his door at 2 in the afternoon was different from the delivery people. Sharper, more purposeful. Daniel opened it to find 2 men in dark suits standing in the hallway, their postures military straight, their expressions professionally neutral. Captain Brooks? The taller of the 2 spoke first. I'm Agent Morrison. This is Agent Chen. We're with the Department of Defense. May we come in? Daniel's stomach tightened. He'd been expecting this, on some level. The military didn't just let people with his background and his security clearances fade into obscurity. especially not after they demonstrated their capabilities on international television. "Let me get my daughter settled first," he said. 10 minutes later, Maya was happily installed in her room with her new elephant and a tablet loaded with educational games, and Daniel was sitting across from two federal agents in his flower-filled living room. "We'll get straight to the point," Morrison said. "Your actions on Flight 447 have attracted significant attention, not just from the media, but from various interested parties within the government. Your service record, your capabilities, your continued relevance." "I'm retired," Daniel said. "Have been for 10 years. Retirement is a state of mind, Captain. The skills you demonstrated 3 nights ago don't expire." Morrison leaned forward slightly. "There are people who would very much like you to come back." "Come back to what exactly?" "To service. Not active duty. We understand you have family obligations, but there are consulting roles, training positions, specialized units that could benefit enormously from your experience." Morrison paused. "The incident on Flight 447 revealed something that many of us suspected but couldn't confirm. You're still one of the best pilots in the world. It would be a waste to let that talent continue to rust at a regional airport." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. He looked around the room, at the flowers and the gifts, at the evidence of gratitude that had transformed his small apartment into something unrecognizable. Then his eyes drifted toward Maya's room, where he could hear her talking softly to her stuffed elephant. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "I appreciate the offer, I truly do. But I left the military because I wanted to be a father first, and everything else second. That hasn't changed. The compensation would be substantial. Your daughter's education, her future. My daughter's future depends on me being present for it." Daniel's voice hardened slightly. "I've already missed too much. I won't miss any more." The agents exchanged glances. Chen spoke for the first time. "Captain Brooks, we're not asking you to abandon your family. We're asking you to consider that there might be ways to serve that don't require you to choose." "Maybe there are. But right now, I need time to figure out what those ways look like. My family comes first. Everything else, the offers, the opportunities, the second chances, all of that can wait." Morrison nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "When you're ready to talk, if you're ever ready, call this number. The offer will remain open." Daniel took the card but didn't look at it. He showed the agents to the door, thanked them for their time, and then stood alone in his hallway, feeling the weight of possibilities pressing down on him from every direction. The media siege began in earnest on day 3. Daniel had known it was coming, but the reality still caught him off guard. Reporters camped outside his building around the clock, their cameras and microphones ready to capture any glimpse of the hero of Flight 447. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical sunflowers. His neighbors, initially sympathetic, had begun to complain about the disruption to their lives. He couldn't go outside without being mobbed. He couldn't take Maya to the park, couldn't walk her to school, couldn't perform any of the normal daily rituals that had defined his existence for the past decade. They were trapped, prisoners of his own heroism. "Daddy, when can we go outside?" Maya asked on the 4th morning, her face pressed against the window as she watched the reporters below. "I want to go to the playground." "Soon, baby, I promise." But he didn't know if it was a promise he could keep. The airline had offered to relocate them temporarily, a hotel, a rental property, somewhere away from the chaos, but Daniel had refused. This was their home. Maya's room was here, her toys, her books, the drawings she'd taped to her walls. He wouldn't let strangers drive them out of their own life. Instead, he called his lawyer. Marcus Webb had been Daniel's attorney since the early days of his military career, handling everything from his discharge paperwork to Alia's estate. He was a small, wiry man with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, and he arrived at the apartment that afternoon with a briefcase full of documents and a plan. "First things first," Marcus said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "You need representation, real representation, media management, public relations, legal protection. Right now, you're a sitting duck." "I don't want to become a celebrity, Marcus." "That ship has sailed. You're already a celebrity. The question is whether you control the narrative or let others control it for you." Marcus pulled out a folder. "I've been fielding calls all week. Everyone from Good Morning America to 60 Minutes to Netflix. They all want your story." I know, I've been deleting the voicemails. Deleting won't make them go away. And here's the thing, Daniel. There's money on the table. Real money. The kind of money that could change Maya's life. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. I didn't save those people for money. Of course you didn't. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't benefit from what happened. You're a single father with a 7-year-old daughter and a maintenance supervisor's salary. The opportunities being presented to you could secure her future permanently. Marcus fixed him with a level stare. You can be modest and still be smart. What are you suggesting? One interview, just one. A serious outlet, respectful treatment, editorial control. Tell your story your way, set the record straight, and then step back. Use the compensation to set up a trust fund for Maya. After that, you can retreat from the spotlight as much as you want. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Through the wall, he could hear Maya singing to herself. That same half-remembered song from the movie. The words still jumbled, but the melody increasingly confident. Who's offering the best terms? Marcus smiled. I thought you'd never ask. The interview was scheduled for the following week. A sit-down with a respected journalist from a major network, filmed in a neutral location away from Daniel's apartment. The terms were favorable. Editorial approval, no ambush questions, a focus on the events of the flight rather than his personal life. The compensation was enough to fund Maya's education from kindergarten through graduate school with money left over. But first, there was something Daniel needed to do. He called Richard Harmon. The captain answered on the third ring, his voice rough with exhaustion. Brooks? Is that really you? It's me. How are you holding up? A long pause. Not great, if I'm being honest. The investigators cleared me of any wrongdoing. The hydraulic failure was a manufacturing defect, nothing anyone could have prevented. But that doesn't make the nightmares any easier. I know, I've been having them too. Really? I would have thought... Harmon trailed off. You would have thought what? That I'm too tough for nightmares? Daniel laughed softly. Captain, I've been having nightmares for 20 years. They're just part of the package. I suppose they are. Another pause. Why did you call, Brooks? Not that I'm not glad to hear from you, but I imagine you're dealing with your own chaos right now. I called because I wanted to check on you, and because I wanted to say something I should have said in Gander. What's that? Thank you. Daniel let the words hang in the air. Thank you for trusting me. I know how hard that must have been, letting a stranger take control of your aircraft in the middle of a crisis. A lot of captains would have refused, would have let pride get in the way. You didn't. You gave me the chance to help, and that's the only reason any of us survived. Harmon was silent for so long that Daniel wondered if the call had dropped. Then quietly, you know what I keep thinking about? The moment you walked into my cockpit. I looked at you and I saw... I don't know what I saw. Just a guy in wrinkled clothes who didn't belong there. And I almost... His voice cracked. I almost sent you away. But you didn't. No. Something in your eyes, maybe. Something that told me you were exactly who you said you were. Harmon took a shaky breath. I've been in aviation my whole adult life. I've trained thousands of hours for emergencies just like that one. And in the moment, none of it mattered. I froze. I knew what was happening. I knew we were dying, and I couldn't think of a single thing to do about it. That's not failure, Captain. That's human. It feels like failure. I know, but here's the truth. You made the right call when it mattered most. You listened to your instincts. You trusted someone you had no reason to trust, and you saved your passengers. Everything else, the fear, the doubt, the moments of hesitation, that's just noise. What counts is the outcome. 243 people alive. 243 people alive, Daniel repeated, including you and me. Another long pause. Then Harmon said something that caught Daniel off guard. Have you talked to Patterson? Who? Gregory Patterson. The guy who volunteered before you did. The retired airline CEO. Daniel had almost forgotten about Patterson, the confident man who'd strode toward the cockpit like he was boarding a yacht, only to be dismissed when his limitations became apparent. No, why? He's been struggling. The media painted him as a punchline. The guy who couldn't help. There have been articles, social media posts, people mocking him for trying to step up when he didn't have the skills. Harmon sighed. I've been meaning to reach out, but I don't know what to say. He put himself forward when no one else would. That takes courage, even if the capabilities weren't there. Daniel thought about this. He remembered Patterson's face when he'd been escorted out of the cockpit. The mixture of humiliation and confusion, the dawning realization that his confident self-assessment had been wrong. It must have been devastating. Do you have his contact information? I can get it. Why? Because you're right. He tried to help. That matters, even if he couldn't. Daniel paused, maybe especially because he couldn't. Gregory Patterson lived in a sprawling colonial house in Connecticut, the kind of property that announced its owner's success from the moment you turned into the driveway. When Daniel arrived 3 days later, having dodged reporters with the help of a hired car and a baseball cap, he found the gates closed and the curtains drawn. The house looked abandoned, but the smoke rising from one of the chimneys said otherwise. He pressed the intercom button and waited. "Who is it?" A woman's voice, sharp with suspicion. "My name is Daniel Brooks. I was on flight 447. I'd like to speak with Mr. Patterson if he's available." A long silence. Then the gate swung open. Patterson met him at the door. The confident man from the aircraft was gone, replaced by someone older and smaller. Diminished by circumstances Daniel understood all too well. His handshake was weak, his eyes unable to quite meet Daniel's. "Mr. Brooks, I wasn't expecting... Please, come in." The interior of the house was immaculate but cold, the kind of space that looked designed rather than lived in. Patterson led him to a sitting room where a fire crackled in an enormous stone fireplace and gestured toward a leather armchair. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Something stronger?" Coffee would be fine. Patterson disappeared into the kitchen, and Daniel used the time to study the room. Awards and photographs lined the walls. Patterson with politicians, with celebrities, with other titans of the business world. A lifetime of achievement, now overshadowed by a single moment of public failure. When Patterson returned with 2 cups of coffee, his hands were trembling slightly. "I assume you've seen the coverage," he said, settling into the chair across from Daniel. "The internet has been unkind. I've seen some of it. CEO who couldn't fly. The real hero and the pretender. My personal favorite, Patterson's fall from grace, when confidence meets reality." Patterson laughed bitterly. 20 years of building airlines from the ground up, and now I'm a meme. "That's why I came." Patterson looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" "I came to thank you." "Thank me?" The surprise curdled into confusion. "For what? For wasting precious minutes during an emergency? For making a fool of myself in front of the entire aircraft? For standing up?" Daniel leaned forward, holding the other man's gaze. "For volunteering when no one else would. For trying to help when every instinct must have been screaming at you to stay in your seat and hope someone else would fix the problem. But I couldn't help. I didn't have the skills." "No, you didn't, but you didn't know that when you raised your hand. All you knew was that an aircraft full of people was in trouble and someone needed to do something. So you did something." Daniel set down his coffee cup. "Mr. Patterson, I spent most of my military career watching people freeze in crisis situations. Not because they were cowards, but because action is hard and inaction is easy. You chose action. That matters." Patterson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "You know what the worst part is? I really believed I could help. I've been around aviation my whole career. I know more about airplanes than most people will ever learn. I thought..." He shook his head. "I thought that would be enough." Knowledge and capability aren't the same thing. I learned that lesson a long time ago, in places much worse than an aircraft cabin. How do you move past it? The humiliation, the public judgment, the knowledge that when it mattered most, you weren't enough? Daniel considered the question carefully. It was one he'd asked himself many times, in different contexts, for different failures. You don't move past it. You move through it. You accept that you tried, you accept that you fell short, and you find meaning in the attempt. He paused. And you remember that being willing to act, even imperfectly, puts you ahead of everyone who stayed in their seats. Patterson stared at him. Why are you being kind to me? The media is praising you and mocking me. You could have just let me fade into obscurity. Because kindness costs nothing, and because I know what it feels like to fail publicly. Daniel stood. I should go. I have a daughter waiting for me at home. Captain Brooks. Patterson rose as well, extending his hand. Thank you. I don't know if this changes anything, but thank you for coming, for saying what you said. Daniel shook his hand. Take care of yourself, Mr. Patterson, and maybe stay off the internet for a while. A genuine laugh escaped Patterson, the first real emotion Daniel had seen from him. That's probably good advice. The drive back to New York gave Daniel time to think. He thought about Patterson, humiliated but resilient. He thought about Harmon, cleared but haunted. He thought about the 243 passengers scattered across the country, trying to return to normal lives that would never quite feel normal again. And he thought about Maya. She had asked him that morning, as he was leaving, why he needed to visit the man from the airplane. He tried to explain about kindness and perspective, about how sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the ones who need the most support. She'd listened with the serious attention she brought to everything, then said something that stopped him in his tracks. Daddy, is that why you stood up? To be kind? He'd knelt down to look her in the eyes. I stood up because people needed help, baby, and because I could help them. But you were scared. Yes, I was scared. So being brave isn't about not being scared? No, sweetheart. Being brave is about being scared and doing the hard thing anyway. She'd nodded slowly, processing this information with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. Then she'd hugged him and whispered, I'm glad you're my daddy. Those words echoed in his mind as the car crossed the state line back into New York. I'm glad you're my daddy, not I'm glad you're a hero, not I'm glad you saved all those people. Just, I'm glad you're my daddy. It was the only validation he'd ever really needed. The interview aired on a Sunday evening, commanding the kind of ratings usually reserved for season finales and presidential addresses. Daniel had prepared extensively with Marcus and a media coach the lawyer had hired, practicing answers to anticipated questions, learning how to speak in sound bites without sacrificing authenticity. But when the cameras started rolling and the journalist, a veteran broadcaster named Catherine Reyes, who had covered everything from wars to presidential scandals, asked her first question, all the preparation fell away. He just told the truth. He talked about his military service, about the missions he could acknowledge and the ones he couldn't. He talked about Aaliyah, using her name for the first time publicly, watching Catherine's expression shift from professional interest to genuine empathy. He talked about the choice to leave the Air Force, about the years of civilian life, about the daily work of raising a daughter alone. And then he talked about the flight. Not the technical details. Those had been covered extensively in the investigation reports. But the human elements. The fear. The doubt. The moment when he'd almost stayed in his seat. The stuffed elephant that had given him something to hold on to when everything else was falling apart. What made you finally stand up? Catherine asked, after all those years of deliberately stepping away from that identity. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, the cameras recording his silence. My daughter, he said finally. I thought about what I would want if she were on that plane, if she were one of those passengers terrified and helpless, and somewhere in the cabin was someone who could help her. I would want that person to stand up. I would need that person to stand up. He paused. So I stood up. And the doubt? The skepticism you faced when you first entered the cockpit? It was understandable. I didn't look like what they were expecting. I didn't fit the image of who they thought could save them. A small smile crossed his face. But the thing about emergencies is they don't care about images. They only care about capability, and capability doesn't have a uniform. The interview continued for another 40 minutes, covering everything from the technical details of the landing to Daniel's plans for the future. But it was that moment, capability doesn't have a uniform, that would be replayed millions of times, quoted in articles and essays, printed on t-shirts and coffee mugs. It would become the phrase that defined him, for better or worse. The aftermath of the interview was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Daniel's name was trending globally. Social media exploded with responses, mostly positive, though there were the inevitable skeptics and critics who questioned his motives, his story, his decision to profit from tragedy. The network reported that the interview had been viewed by over 30 million people, making it one of the most watched broadcast events of the year, and the offers kept coming. Book deals, movie rights, speaking engagements, corporate sponsorships. Everyone wanted a piece of the hero of Flight 447, and they were willing to pay handsomely for the privilege. Daniel accepted almost none of them. He took one book deal, a modest advance for a memoir focused on his military service and the events of the flight, with a significant portion of proceeds going to aviation safety charities. He agreed to 3 speaking engagements at aviation conferences where he could talk about emergency procedures and the importance of crisis training. He declined everything else. "You're leaving money on the table," Marcus told him, not for the first time. "Serious money." "I know. Maya's trust fund is secure, but there's so much more you could do. Scholarships, charitable foundations, long-term investments." "I know, Marcus." Daniel's voice was firm, but not unkind. "But I didn't become a symbol so I could monetize it. I became a symbol because I did the right thing in a terrible moment. If I spend the rest of my life cashing in on that moment, I become something else, something I don't want to be." "And what do you want to be?" Daniel looked out the window of Marcus's office at the New York skyline stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Maya was at school, learning about fractions or dinosaurs or whatever second graders learned about these days. She was growing up, she was becoming her own person, and she was watching her father navigate this strange new reality, learning lessons about integrity and values that would shape who she became. "I want to be someone she's proud of," he said quietly. "Not because I'm famous, but because I'm good." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's not a bad answer. It's the only one I've got." 3 weeks after the interview, the investigation into Flight 447's hydraulic failure was concluded. The findings were damning: a manufacturing defect in the hydraulic system components, a failure of quality control that had allowed faulty parts to be installed in dozens of aircraft. The airline was absolved of direct responsibility, but the manufacturer faced massive lawsuits and regulatory penalties. Changes to inspection protocols were recommended and implemented. The skies, theoretically, became a little bit safer. Daniel received a copy of the final report by courier. He read it in his apartment, alone, while Maya slept in the next room. The technical language described what had happened in clinical, dispassionate terms: pressure loss, system degradation, control surface malfunction. Nowhere did it capture the terror, the desperation, the moment-by-moment fight for survival that he had experienced. That was probably for the best. What did capture his attention was a section near the end, buried in appendices that most readers would never reach. It was a detailed analysis of the manual backup procedure he had used, the unconventional techniques, the split-second decisions, the physical inputs that had kept the aircraft controllable when every computer system had failed. The analysis concluded with a single sentence that made Daniel's breath catch. "The successful outcome of Flight 447 represents an unprecedented demonstration of manual aircraft control under conditions previously believed to be unsurvivable." Previously believed to be unsurvivable. He read those words over and over, letting their weight settle into his bones. He had done the impossible. He had saved 243 people from a death that every expert, every engineer, every probability calculation said was inevitable. And he had done it not because he was superhuman, but because he had trained for decades to do exactly what that moment required. The pilot he had buried was not dead. The pilot had been waiting. And when the moment came, when the impossible was the only option left, the pilot had risen. Now Daniel had to figure out what to do with him. The answer came, as many answers do, from an unexpected source. It was a Saturday afternoon, 2 months after the flight, and Daniel was sitting in the park watching Maya play on the swings. The reporters had finally lost interest, moving on to the next crisis, the next hero, the next story that would capture the public's attention for 15 minutes before fading into the background noise. Life had returned to something approaching normal, or at least the new normal that Daniel was still learning to navigate. His phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He almost ignored it, as he'd ignored so many others, but something made him answer. "Captain Brooks? This is Sarah Chen from the Transportation Safety Board. We met in Gander." "I remember. How can I help you? I'm calling with an unusual request. We're developing a new training program for commercial pilots. Advanced emergency procedures with a focus on manual reversion techniques and degraded system operations. The kind of skills that almost no civilian pilots ever need, but that saved 243 lives on Flight 447. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. Go on? We'd like you to help us design the curriculum. And if you're willing, to serve as a guest instructor. Your experience is unique. The combination of military combat flying and commercial aircraft systems gives you a perspective that no one else in the world has. You could help train the next generation of pilots to handle situations that we used to believe were unsurvivable. Daniel watched Maya soar on the swings, her laughter carrying across the park like music. What would the commitment look like? Flexible. We understand you have family obligations. The program would be based in New York, and we could structure your involvement around your daughter's schedule. No deployments, no extended travel, just consultation, curriculum development, and occasional hands-on instruction. And I'd be teaching pilots how to do what I did? You'd be teaching them how to survive situations that no textbook can prepare them for. You'd be sharing knowledge that exists nowhere else, knowledge that could save thousands of lives over the course of a career. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. He thought about all the offers he'd declined, all the opportunities he'd turned away because they felt like exploitation rather than purpose. This was different. This was taking what he'd learned through decades of training and sacrifice and using it to make the world safer. This was the kind of legacy he could be proud of. Can I have some time to think about it? Of course. Take as long as you need. He ended the call and sat watching his daughter, who had abandoned the swings in favor of the monkey bars. She moved with confidence, swinging from bar to bar, never doubting that her hands would find their grip. She was fearless in the way that children are fearless, not because she didn't understand risk, but because she trusted herself to handle whatever came. He had taught her that. Not through words, but through example. Through years of showing up, being present, demonstrating that courage wasn't about the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Now he had a chance to teach others the same lesson. That evening, after Maya was asleep, Daniel made 2 phone calls. The first was to Sarah Chen. He told her he would do it. He would help design the training program, would share everything he knew, would pour his experience into a curriculum that might one day save lives he would never meet. The second call was to Denise. I've made a decision, he told his sister, about what comes next. And? I'm going to keep flying, not the way I used to, not combat, not the things that kept me away from Maya, but training, teaching, using what I know to help other pilots become better. Daniel, that's wonderful. Denise's voice was warm with approval. That's exactly the kind of thing Aaliyah would have wanted for you. You think so? I know so. She always said you were meant to be in the sky. She just wanted you to find a way to do it that didn't cost you your family. Daniel closed his eyes, remembering his wife's face, her smile, her laugh, the way she'd looked at him on their wedding day with such complete trust. She had loved the pilot. She had also loved the man, and she had believed, even when he didn't, that he could be both. I think I finally found it, he said. I think I finally found a way. Then go do it. He could hear the smile in Denise's voice. Go be the pilot and the father. Go be everything you were always meant to be. Daniel hung up the phone and stood by the window, looking out at the city lights stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, aircraft were taking off and landing, carrying hundreds of thousands of souls through the sky. Most of those flights would be routine, unremarkable, forgotten the moment the passengers stepped off the jetway. But some of them might not be. Some of them might encounter failures and emergencies, moments where everything went wrong and survival depended on skills that existed in only a handful of people in the world. He could help change that. He could take what he'd learned, in combat, in crisis, in the terrible hours above the Atlantic, and give it to others. He could multiply his capabilities 100-fold, 1,000-fold, by training the pilots who would face the emergencies of tomorrow. He could save lives he would never know, from disasters that hadn't happened yet. And he could do it all while being present for Maya, while walking her to school and helping with homework and being there for every moment that mattered. The pilot and the father, both. Finally, at the same time. Daniel Brooks smiled in the darkness of his apartment, feeling something settle into place that had been displaced for a decade. He was home, and for the first time since Aaliyah's death, he knew exactly where he was going. The training facility was located 40 minutes outside the city, a sprawling complex of hangars and classrooms and full-motion flight simulators that the Transportation Safety Board had converted from an old military installation. Daniel arrived for his first day as a consultant on a cold Monday morning in January, 3 months after the flight that had changed everything, with a leather messenger bag over his shoulder and a quiet determination in his heart. The program director met him at the entrance, a compact woman in her 50s named Dr. Helen Park, whose credentials included 2 decades of aviation psychology research and a reputation for being impossible to impress. Captain Brooks? Her handshake was firm, her eyes assessing. Welcome to the Advanced Emergency Response Training Program, or AERTP, if you prefer acronyms. I try to avoid them when possible. A flicker of amusement crossed her face. Good, we'll get along fine. She gestured for him to follow her through a maze of corridors, past windows that looked into classrooms where pilots sat studying dense technical manuals, past doors marked with warnings about active simulations in progress. I'll be honest with you, Captain. There was significant debate about bringing you on board because of my lack of commercial certification. Because of everything. Your military background is impressive, but it's also classified to a degree that makes verification challenging. Your actions on Flight 447 were extraordinary, but they were also undocumented until after the fact. Some of my colleagues felt we would be building a program around a man whose capabilities we couldn't independently confirm. Daniel nodded slowly. And what convinced you otherwise? The flight recorder data. Helen stopped at a window overlooking a massive hangar where a full-scale aircraft mock-up sat surrounded by scaffolding. We analyzed every input you made during that approach and landing, every adjustment, every correction, every split-second decision, and what we found was, she paused, searching for the right word, unprecedented. The precision of your control inputs, the anticipation of aircraft behavior, the improvisation under conditions that should have been fatal. It wasn't just skill, it was artistry. I'm not sure I'd call it that. I would. And so would every pilot who's reviewed the data. She turned to face him directly. Captain Brooks, you did things in that aircraft that our best simulators say are impossible. You found solutions that our computers couldn't calculate. Whatever combination of training and talent and instinct allowed you to do that. We want to bottle it. We want to give it to every pilot who might one day face the same situation. That's why I'm here. Good. Helen smiled for the first time, a brief professional expression that nevertheless carried genuine warmth. Then let's get started. The first 3 weeks were spent in meetings. Endless, exhausting meetings where Daniel sat across from engineers and psychologists and curriculum designers, explaining in painstaking detail every decision he had made during the flight. They wanted to understand not just what he had done, but why. The mental processes, the perceptual cues, the intuitive leaps that had allowed him to maintain control when every system was failing. It was more difficult than he'd expected. So much of what he'd done had been instinctive, automatic, the product of training so deep it had become part of his nervous system. Putting it into words felt like trying to explain how to breathe. Tell me about the moment you decided to induce the asymmetric skid, one engineer asked during their 4th session. The data shows a deliberate left rudder input at approximately 140 knots. What triggered that decision? Daniel closed his eyes, putting himself back in the cockpit. The screaming alarms, the shuddering airframe, the runway rushing toward them at impossible speed. I could feel the aircraft wanting to roll right, he said slowly. The asymmetric weight distribution from the fuel remaining in the left wing. There was maybe 2,000 pounds more on that side. The aircraft wanted to tip that direction during the rollout. If I let it, we would have cartwheeled. So you anticipated the rollout characteristics before touchdown? I anticipated them from the moment I realized we had no braking authority. The whole approach was calculated backward from what the landing roll would look like. The engineer scribbled notes furiously. That's not in any manual. That's not part of any standard procedure. No, it's not. Daniel opened his eyes. It's what you learn when you've landed damaged aircraft in combat. You don't think about the touchdown. You think about the stop. Everything else is just getting there. Those sessions became the foundation of the new curriculum. Every insight Daniel could articulate was captured, analyzed, and transformed into teaching material. Exercises were designed to develop the specific cognitive skills he had demonstrated. Simulator scenarios were created to put pilots in situations where standard procedures would fail, forcing them to improvise. It was grueling work. Daniel often came home exhausted, his mind wrung dry from the effort of externalizing knowledge that had lived in his muscles and reflexes for decades. But it was also deeply satisfying. Every principle he managed to communicate, every technique he could explain, was a potential life saved somewhere down the line. And through it all, Maya remained his anchor. She had adjusted to their new life with the resilience that children possess and adults forget. The famous father who was occasionally recognized in public had become simply Daddy who teaches other pilots. The reporters who had once camped outside their building had moved on to other stories, and the flowers that had filled their apartment had long since wilted and been replaced by the normal clutter of family life. "Daddy," she asked one evening as he helped her with her homework, "do your students know about the airplane?" "You mean Flight 447? "Yeah. Do they know you were the one who landed it?" "Most of them do, yes. It's part of why they're there, to learn how to do what I did." Maya considered this with the serious expression she always wore when processing something important. "So you're teaching them to be heroes?" "I'm teaching them to be ready. Being a hero isn't something you can teach. It's something that happens when ordinary people face extraordinary situations and choose not to give up." "Were you ordinary? Before the airplane?" The question hit Daniel harder than he'd expected. He set down the pencil he'd been using to check her math and looked at his daughter, really looked at her, at this small person who was trying to understand her father's place in the world. "I think so," he said finally. "I had special training, and I'd done some things that most people never do. But inside, where it counts, I was just a person, a dad who missed his wife and worried about his daughter and tried to do the right thing when it mattered." "That doesn't sound ordinary to me." Daniel smiled and pulled her close for a hug. "Maybe that's the secret, baby. Maybe all the extraordinary people are just ordinary people who didn't give up when things got hard." Maya hugged him back, her small arms tight around his neck. "I'm glad you didn't give up, Daddy." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." The first cohort of pilots arrived in April. 16 men and women from airlines around the world, selected for the program based on their demonstrated skill and their potential for handling extreme emergencies. They came from different backgrounds: commercial captains, military veterans, cargo pilots, test pilots. But they shared a common quality that Daniel recognized immediately. They were all people who had faced the edge of disaster and wanted to be better prepared for the next time. The first day was orientation, and Daniel was scheduled to give the opening remarks. He stood at the front of the classroom, looking out at faces that regarded him with a mixture of respect and skepticism. Some of them had seen the interview. Some of them had read the investigation report. All of them knew his reputation, but reputation was just words until proven otherwise. "My name is Daniel Brooks," he began. "Some of you know my story. For those who don't, here's the short version. I spent 15 years flying combat missions for the Air Force. I retired. I spent 10 years trying to be a normal person. And then on a red-eye flight over the Atlantic, I got pulled back into the cockpit for a few hours that changed everything." He paused, letting his eyes travel across the room. "You're here because someone thinks you have what it takes to handle the unsurvivable, the situations that no checklist can cover, the emergencies that fall outside every procedure you've ever trained for. Over the next 6 months, we're going to push you harder than you've ever been pushed. We're going to put you in scenarios that will make you feel stupid and incompetent and completely out of your depth. And when you come out the other side, you're going to understand something that most pilots never learn." He stepped away from the podium and walked toward the front row. "The aircraft doesn't care about your ego. The physics of flight don't care about your experience. When everything fails, when the computers are dark and the hydraulics are gone and you're flying a 300-ton miracle with nothing but your hands and your instincts, the only thing that matters is whether you can think clearly in the middle of terror." He stopped in front of a young woman with sharp eyes and an Air Force insignia on her jacket. "What's your name?" "Captain Sarah Mitchell, sir, C-17 Globemaster." 6 years. Captain Mitchell, when was the last time you were genuinely afraid in an aircraft? She hesitated. A few years ago, crosswind landing in Afghanistan. We were getting shot at during approach. And what did you do with that fear? I used it, channeled it into focus. Good. That's the first lesson. Daniel turned to address the whole room again. Fear isn't your enemy. Fear is your body telling you that something important is happening. The goal isn't to eliminate fear. That's impossible and probably suicidal. The goal is to build a relationship with it, to let it sharpen your mind instead of paralyzing it. He walked back to the podium and pulled out a small gray object from his pocket, the stuffed elephant. Maya had insisted he take it, had said it would bring him luck with his new students. I kept this in my pocket during the Flight 447 landing. It belonged to a little girl who was traveling alone. She was 8 years old, scared, completely helpless. Every time I felt the fear trying to take over, I touched this elephant and thought about her, thought about what I was fighting for. He set the elephant on the podium. You need to find your elephant, something that matters enough to cut through the noise, something that reminds you why you're fighting when every part of your brain is screaming at you to give up. He looked at each pilot in turn. Find that thing, hold on to it, because when the worst happens, that might be all you have. The room was silent. Then Captain Mitchell spoke up. Sir, with respect, how do you know when to break the rules? When to stop following procedure and start improvising? Daniel smiled. It was the right question, the question that would define everything they were about to learn. That's what the next 6 months are for. Any other questions? There weren't. Good. Then let's get to work. The training was brutal by design. Daniel had worked with Helen Park and her team to create scenarios that would systematically strip away every safety net pilots had come to rely on. Hydraulic failures, electrical cascades, control surface malfunctions, scenarios where the standard response was demonstrably inadequate, where survival required creative thinking under impossible pressure. The simulator sessions were the worst. Daniel would sit in the observation room, watching through glass as pilots faced emergencies that grew progressively more severe. The full-motion simulators replicated the sensations of flight with terrifying accuracy. The G-forces, the vibrations, the visceral feeling of an aircraft fighting against its operator. Pilots emerged from sessions pale and shaking, humbled by the realization of how quickly things could go wrong. I froze. One pilot, a 30-year veteran named Marcus Chen, no relation to the first officer from Flight 447, admitted after a particularly devastating session. The moment the third hydraulic system failed, my brain just stopped. I couldn't think. I couldn't act. I just sat there while the aircraft fell out of the sky. That's normal, Daniel told him. That's what happens when your brain encounters a situation it has no framework for processing. The training you've had your entire career taught you to rely on systems and procedures. When those systems fail, your brain doesn't know what to do next. So how do I fix it? You build new frameworks. You practice scenarios that have no good solutions until your brain stops expecting good solutions. You learn to think in terms of least bad outcomes instead of successful outcomes. Daniel put a hand on the man's shoulder. You failed today. You'll probably fail tomorrow too, but somewhere around week 3 or 4, something will click. You'll start seeing options you couldn't see before. And when that happens, you'll be ready. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of frustration and determination. One more time, he asked. Daniel smiled. One more time. The transformations were remarkable to witness. Pilots who had entered the program confident in their abilities were broken down to their foundations, their assumptions challenged, their certainties stripped away. And then, gradually, they were rebuilt. They learned to see aircraft as dynamic systems rather than static machines. They learned to feel the subtle cues that predicted failures before they happened. They learned to improvise, to adapt, to think 3 steps ahead of disaster. Sarah Mitchell, the young Air Force captain who had asked the first question, proved to be one of the standouts. She had a natural instinct for reading aircraft behavior, a gift for remaining calm under pressure that reminded Daniel of himself at that age. By month 3, she was completing scenarios that had defeated pilots with twice her experience. You're good, Daniel told her after a particularly impressive session. But you know that already. I know I have room to improve. That's the right answer. But I'm curious. What made you apply for this program? You're already one of the best pilots in the Air Force. You don't need the credentials. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. My father was on a commercial flight that went down when I was 12. Mountain terrain in bad weather. No survivors. She met Daniel's eyes. The investigation found that the pilots did everything by the book. Every procedure, every checklist, exactly as they were trained. And they still died. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago, and I've made peace with it. She straightened her shoulders. But it taught me something important. The book isn't enough. Procedures aren't enough. When things go wrong, really wrong, you need something more. You need the ability to see beyond what you've been taught and find solutions that don't exist in any manual. Daniel nodded slowly. That's why you're here. That's why I'm here. And that's why I'm going to be the best pilot to ever come through this program. A slight smile crossed her face. Sir? I believe you will be, Captain Mitchell. Daniel returned the smile. I believe you will be. Summer arrived, and with it came an unexpected visitor. Daniel was in his office reviewing simulator data when Helen Park appeared in the doorway with an expression he couldn't quite read. You have a guest, she said. He's waiting in conference room B. Who is it? I think you should see for yourself. Puzzled, Daniel followed her through the facility to the conference room. Through the glass walls, he could see a figure sitting at the table, a man in an expensive suit, silver-haired, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to authority. Gregory Patterson. Daniel entered the room slowly, uncertain what to expect. He hadn't spoken to the man since their conversation at his Connecticut estate, though he'd occasionally seen Patterson's name in the news. The media mockery had faded, replaced by carefully managed stories about the former CEO's philanthropic activities and quiet return to the aviation industry as a consultant. Mr. Patterson. Daniel extended his hand. This is unexpected. Patterson rose and shook it firmly. More firmly than before, Daniel noticed. Something had changed in the man's bearing. Captain Brooks, thank you for seeing me without notice. He gestured toward a chair. May I? Of course. They sat across from each other, the conference room suddenly feeling very small. I'll get straight to the point, Patterson said. I've spent the last several months doing a great deal of thinking about that night, about my choices, about what kind of person I want to be going forward. He paused. Your visit to my home was the beginning of that process. What you said about the value of trying, even when you fail, it's stuck with me. I'm glad. But I realized that being told something isn't the same as understanding it. I needed to do something, to prove to myself that I could contribute meaningfully, not just write checks and give speeches. Patterson reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. This is a proposal for a scholarship program, fully funded. It would provide advanced training for pilots from underprivileged backgrounds. People who have the talent and the drive, but not the resources to access the kind of education that produces elite aviators. Daniel took the document and scanned its contents. The numbers were impressive. Enough funding for dozens of scholarships annually, covering everything from basic flight training to advanced emergency certifications. This is generous, he said, but why bring it to me? Because I want your involvement, not just your endorsement, your active participation. I want you to help design the selection criteria. I want you to mentor the recipients. I want this program to carry your philosophy of what it means to be a truly prepared pilot. Patterson leaned forward. You told me that being willing to act, even imperfectly, puts you ahead of those who stay in their seats. This is me acting. This is me trying to contribute something meaningful instead of just accepting that my moment has passed. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying the man across from him. The humiliated CEO he'd met in Connecticut was gone, replaced by someone who had found purpose in failure. It was a transformation Daniel recognized. He'd gone through something similar himself. What do you want from this, Mr. Patterson? Really? Redemption is too strong a word. Let's call it relevance. I want to matter in a way that actually helps people, not just a way that makes me feel important. Patterson smiled slightly. And I want to prove that the man who couldn't help on Flight 447 can still make a difference somewhere else. Daniel looked at the proposal again. Then he set it down on the table and extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Mr. Patterson." The summer progressed, and the first cohort of pilots approached their graduation. Daniel had watched them transform over 6 months from skilled aviators into something more, something harder to define but unmistakable when you saw it. They moved differently now, they spoke differently. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who had stared down the worst and found resources within themselves they hadn't known existed. The final exercise was designed to test everything they'd learned. It was a full-scale scenario, multiple simultaneous failures, degrading conditions, no good options, run in the most advanced simulator available. Each pilot would face it alone, with the entire faculty watching and evaluating. Those who passed would graduate. Those who didn't would receive additional training and another chance. Sarah Mitchell went first. Daniel watched from the observation room as she settled into the simulator cockpit, her movements calm and precise. The scenario began simply enough, a routine transatlantic flight. Nothing remarkable. Then 12 minutes in, the first failure struck. Electrical system cascade. Half the instruments went dark. Sarah's response was immediate, switching to backup systems, prioritizing essential functions, maintaining control while assessing the extent of the damage. Good. Expected. Then the second failure, hydraulic system 1 offline. Her hands moved faster now, compensating for the lost authority, adjusting her control inputs to account for the increased resistance. Still calm. Still focused. Third failure, hydraulic system 2. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. This was the critical point, the moment where most pilots' training ran out, where the procedure stopped and the improvisation began. Sarah's expression didn't change. She had entered a state that Daniel recognized intimately, the zone beyond fear, beyond conscious thought, where the body and the aircraft became a single system responding to threats in real time. Fourth failure, primary flight computers offline. The aircraft was now in mechanical backup mode, just as Flight 437 had been. Every input required physical force. Every correction required anticipation of aircraft behavior that no computer was helping to predict. Sarah flew it like she'd been born in that cockpit. She found the trim settings that minimized workload. She identified the control surface positions that gave her the most authority with the least effort. She talked herself through the approach, calling out altitude and speed and attitude in a steady voice that never wavered. And then the final test, simulated runway incursion during approach. A vehicle on the runway at the last possible moment, requiring an immediate go-around with no hydraulic power and failing electrical systems. Most pilots would have crashed. Sarah Mitchell executed a climbing turn that used the aircraft's momentum and the remaining control authority to clear the obstacle, then repositioned for a second approach and landed with barely a tremor. The simulator went dark. Sarah sat motionless for a long moment, her hands still on the controls. Then she removed her headset and turned to look at the observation window, where Daniel and the rest of the faculty were already on their feet. He gave her a single nod. She nodded back. The graduation ceremony was held on a warm August evening, with families and colleagues gathered in the facility's main hangar. Daniel stood at the podium, looking out at the 16 pilots who had become, in some ways, his students, his colleagues, and his legacy. 6 months ago, he began, you walked into this facility believing you knew what it meant to be a pilot. You had experience. You had credentials. You had confidence in your abilities, and over the following weeks, we systematically destroyed all of that. A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd. We put you in situations where your experience was useless, where your credentials meant nothing, where your confidence was revealed as a thin shell over a deep well of uncertainty. We broke you down because that's the only way to build something stronger. He paused, letting his eyes travel across the faces of his graduates. What you're taking away from this program isn't a technique. It isn't a checklist. It isn't even a skill in the traditional sense. What you're taking away is a mindset, a way of thinking about emergencies that will serve you no matter what specific situation you face. You've learned to see options where others see only disaster. You've learned to act when others freeze. You've learned that the impossible is just the unexplored, and that the human capacity for adaptation exceeds any machine ever built. He picked up the stack of certificates on the podium. When you return to your airlines and your squadrons and your commands, you'll look like the same pilots who left 6 months ago, but you won't be. You'll be carrying something invisible, something that no instrument can detect and no computer can replicate. You'll be carrying the knowledge that when the worst happens, when every system fails and every procedure is exhausted, you have the ability to find a way through. He began calling names, handing certificates to pilots who had become warriors. Captain Sarah Mitchell. She stepped forward, her Air Force uniform crisp and her eyes bright. As Daniel handed her the certificate, she leaned close. "Thank you, sir, for everything." "Don't thank me," he replied quietly. "Go save lives. That's thanks enough." She smiled and stepped back into line with the others. After the ceremony, after the photographs and the congratulations and the tearful goodbyes, Daniel found himself alone in the hangar. The chairs had been cleared, the podium removed, and the space felt vast and empty in the fading evening light. He walked to the center of the floor and stood beneath the aircraft mock-up that dominated the space, a full-scale replica of an A330, the same type he had landed on that impossible night over Gander. He reached up and touched the cold metal of the wing, feeling the rivets beneath his fingertips. Quite a day. He turned to find Helen Park approaching across the hangar floor. "Yes," he agreed. "Yes, it was. The first cohort of many, I hope." She came to stand beside him, looking up at the aircraft. "You know, when I first proposed this program, most people thought I was crazy. Advanced emergency training for commercial pilots, teaching techniques that fell outside every established protocol. It sounded like a liability nightmare. What changed their minds?" Flight 447 changed their minds. Or rather, you did. She turned to face him. "You proved that what we were proposing wasn't just theory. You proved that human capability can exceed systematic limitation. And now we have 16 pilots out there carrying that proof with them everywhere they fly. 16 isn't many. It's 16 more than we had before, and next year there will be another 16, and the year after that. And eventually, what we're teaching here will become standard. Eventually, every pilot will have the skills you demonstrated." Daniel considered this. The thought of his knowledge spreading, multiplying, becoming part of the collective wisdom of aviation, it was more than he'd ever dreamed possible when he'd agreed to this job. "Can I tell you something?" Helen asked. "Of course. The data analysis we did on your Flight 447 performance, we've run it through dozens of simulations, hundreds. We've tried to replicate what you did with our best pilots, with our most advanced algorithms, with every tool available to modern aviation science." She paused. "We've never succeeded. Not once." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean that what you did that night shouldn't have been possible. The control inputs you made, the timing, the precision, it exceeded what we can explain through training or talent or luck. There was something else at work, something we can't quantify. I had good teachers, 25 years of experience. Combat flying teaches you things that can't be taught any other way. Maybe. Or maybe there's something about the human spirit under pressure that we don't yet understand, something that emerges only when survival is at stake." Helen smiled. "Whatever it was, we're doing our best to bottle it. Even if we never quite succeed, the attempt is making pilots better." She extended her hand. "Thank you, Captain Brooks, for everything you've given us." Daniel shook her hand. "Thank you for giving me a chance to matter again." "You always mattered. You just forgot for a while." She walked away, leaving Daniel alone with the aircraft and his thoughts. He stood there for a long time, watching the last light fade through the hangar windows. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. Aaliyah's death, his years of exile from the sky, the impossible night over Gander, the transformation from invisible passenger to reluctant hero to teacher of heroes. Every step had seemed random at the time. Every choice had felt like a response to circumstance rather than a movement toward purpose. But standing here now, in this hangar surrounded by the tools of his life's work, Daniel could see the pattern, could see how the fighter pilot had become the father, had become the hero, had become the mentor. Each identity building on the last, each transformation preparing him for the next. He wasn't the same man who had boarded Flight 407 all those months ago. He wasn't the invisible passenger in seat 8A, hoping to disappear into obscurity. He wasn't even the desperate pilot fighting gravity with his bare hands. He was something new, Something that combined all of those experiences into a single coherent purpose. He was Daniel Brooks, father, pilot, teacher, survivor, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. His phone buzzed. A text from Maya. "Daddy, when are you coming home? Aunt Denise made spaghetti, but I saved you some." Daniel smiled at the screen, at the simple words that represented everything he had fought for, everything he continued to fight for. "On my way, baby girl," he typed back. "Keep my plate warm." He took one last look at the aircraft above him, then turned and walked out of the hangar into the warm August night. The stars were emerging overhead, the same stars that had watched over him during the worst night of his life, the same stars that would continue to watch over every pilot who carried his teachings into the sky. He had saved 243 lives on Flight 447, but in this hangar, through this program, he would save thousands more. Millions, maybe, over the decades to come. That was a legacy worth building. That was a purpose worth living for. Daniel Brooks climbed into his car and drove home to his daughter, leaving the facility's lights glowing behind him like a beacon against the darkness. There was spaghetti, waiting. 5 years passed like water through fingers. Maya turned 12 in a small ceremony at their new apartment in Brooklyn Heights, surrounded by friends from school and family members who had watched her transform from a gap-toothed 7-year-old into a thoughtful, curious young woman with her mother's eyes and her father's quiet determination. She blew out the candles on a chocolate cake that Daniel had spent 3 hours perfecting, and when she made her wish, she kept it secret in the way that all the most important wishes must be kept. Daniel watched her from across the room, feeling the particular ache that comes from watching time do its patient work on the people we love. She was taller now, nearly to his shoulder, with braids that she'd learned to do herself and opinions about everything from climate change to the best pizza in New York. She still had the stuffed elephant, the one from the flight, the one that had belonged to Sophie, though it lived on a shelf in her room now, a memento rather than a companion. She was growing up. She was becoming herself. And Daniel had been there for all of it. That was the victory that mattered most. The training program had expanded beyond anything Daniel had imagined during those first uncertain months. What had started as a small initiative housed in a converted military facility had grown into an international enterprise, with satellite programs in 12 countries and a waiting list of pilots that stretched years into the future. The Patterson Scholarship Fund, Gregory Patterson's redemption project, had sponsored over 300 trainees from underprivileged backgrounds, some of whom had gone on to become instructors themselves. Daniel had stepped back from day-to-day operations 2 years ago, handing the reins to Helen Park and a new generation of teachers who had absorbed his philosophy and made it their own. He still consulted occasionally, still gave the occasional lecture, or participated in curriculum reviews, but his role had evolved from practitioner to elder statesman. He had given what he had to give, and now it was time to let others carry it forward, which left him free, finally, to focus on what had always mattered most. "Daddy?" Maya appeared beside him as the party wound down, her slice of cake half eaten and her expression thoughtful. "Can I ask you something?" "Always, baby." "My friends at school, they keep asking me about the flight. About what happened. They saw something online, a documentary or something." She hesitated. "They want to know if you're really a hero." Daniel set down his own plate and turned to face his daughter fully. This conversation had happened before, in various forms, at various ages, but Maya was older now, old enough for a different kind of answer. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think you saved a lot of people. I think you did something really brave and really hard, and most people couldn't have done it." She paused. "But I also think that's not the most important thing about you." "What's the most important thing?" Maya looked at him with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to understand. "You stayed," she said simply. "After Mom died, you could have gone back to flying. You could have been important and famous and done all the things you used to do. But you didn't. You stayed here and made me breakfast and helped with homework and took me to the park even when you were tired." Her voice softened. "That's the hero thing, not the airplane. The staying." Daniel felt his throat tighten. For a moment he couldn't speak. "Come here," he managed finally, and pulled her into a hug that said everything words couldn't. They stood like that for a long time, father and daughter, surrounded by the remnants of a birthday party and the accumulated evidence of a life well lived. When they finally separated, both of them had tears in their eyes. "I love you, Maya." "I love you too, Daddy." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Now can we please have more cake? Because Aunt Denise is about to finish it, and I didn't get seconds yet." Daniel laughed, a full, genuine laugh that felt like release. "Go, save your cake. I'll handle the cleanup." She darted off, and Daniel watched her go with a heart so full it hurt. The stain. That was what mattered. Everything else was just the story around it. The call came 6 months later on an ordinary Wednesday morning that gave no warning of the extraordinary turn it was about to take. Daniel was making breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, Maya's favorite, when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, as he'd ignored thousands of similar calls over the years. But something made him answer. "Mr. Brooks? This is Dr. Amanda Foster calling from Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston." Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. Hospital calls were never good news. "Yes? I'm calling about a patient who was admitted yesterday. She's been asking for you specifically, and she's quite insistent. Her name is Sophie Hartwell." The name hit Daniel like a physical blow. Sophie. The little girl from the flight. The one who had given him her elephant, who had anchored him through the worst moments of his life, who had become a symbol of everything he'd been fighting for. She would be 13 now, the same age as Maya. "Is she okay? What happened?" "She's stable, but she's been through a serious accident. A car crash. Her parents..." "Doctor," Foster hesitated. "Her parents didn't survive. Sophie has been asking for you since she regained consciousness. She says you're the only one who will understand." Daniel closed his eyes. The world tilted around him, and for a moment he was back in the cockpit of Flight 447, feeling the weight of an impossible responsibility settling onto his shoulders. "I'll be there as soon as I can," he said. The drive to Boston took 4 hours, during which Daniel had time to process what he'd learned and what he was walking into. Sophie's parents, the mother and father who had trusted the airline to deliver their daughter safely to her grandmother in Toronto 5 years ago, had been killed in a head-on collision with a drunk driver. Sophie had been in the back seat. She had survived with broken bones and internal injuries, but the psychological damage was something no surgeon could address. She had woken up asking for Daniel Brooks, the man who had saved her once before. When he arrived at the hospital, a social worker met him in the lobby, a tired-looking woman named Patricia, who explained the situation in gentle, clinical terms. Sophie had no other family. Her grandmother had passed away 2 years ago. There were no aunts or uncles, no godparents, no one who could step into the void that her parents' death had created. She was alone. "She's been asking for you constantly," Patricia said as they walked toward the pediatric ward. "At first we thought she was confused. The trauma, the medication, the grief. But she was very specific. Daniel Brooks, the pilot from Flight 447. She said you gave her back her elephant." "I did." "She still has it. It was in the car with her. The paramedics found it clutched in her hands when they pulled her from the wreckage." Daniel stopped walking. He stood in the hospital corridor surrounded by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of monitors, and felt the full weight of what he was about to face settle over him. This child had lost everything: her parents, her home, her sense of safety in the world. And in her darkest moment, she had reached out for the only anchor she could remember, a stranger who had once carried her elephant in his pocket while fighting to keep an aircraft in the sky. He had saved her life 5 years ago. Now she needed him to save it again. "Take me to her," he said. Sophie looked smaller than he remembered, though of course she wasn't. She was a teenager now, long-limbed and awkward in the way of all 13-year-olds. But lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines and monitors, with bruises mottling her face and her arm in a cast, she looked like the frightened little girl who had handed over her stuffed elephant to a flight attendant on the worst night of both their lives. She was awake when he entered. Her eyes, green, he noticed now, a deep forest green, fixed on him immediately. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I came." Daniel pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down, bringing himself to her level. "How are you feeling?" "Terrible." Her voice cracked. "Everything hurts. And my parents, she couldn't finish the sentence. I know. I'm so sorry. Sophie's hand found his, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who had just survived a catastrophic accident. Do you remember me? She asked, from the airplane. I remember everything. I remember the elephant. I remember telling the captain to make sure you got off first. I remember thinking about you during the landing, using you as a reason to keep fighting. They told me that. Later, when I was older. They said you kept my elephant in your pocket and it helped you be brave. Tears began to stream down her face. I wanted you to come because I thought maybe you could help me be brave too. Daniel felt something break open inside him. The same feeling he'd had 5 years ago, standing on that frozen Canadian tarmac, watching the sun rise over an aircraft that should have been his grave. Sophie, listen to me. He leaned forward, holding her gaze. What you're feeling right now, the fear, the grief, the sense that everything has ended and nothing will ever be okay again. I know that feeling. I know it intimately. I felt it when my wife died and I was left alone with a 2-year-old daughter and no idea how to survive. Sophie's eyes widened. You lost someone too? I lost the person who made my life make sense, and for a long time afterward, I didn't know how to keep going. I thought about giving up. I thought about all the ways I could escape from the pain. He paused. But I had a daughter who needed me. And the need to be there for her became the thing that kept me moving forward when I couldn't find any other reason. I don't have anyone, Sophie whispered. My grandma's gone. My parents are gone. There's no one left. That's not true. Daniel squeezed her hand. You have me. She stared at him, confusion and hope and fear all warring in her expression. What do you mean? I mean that you reached out for help, and I'm here. I mean that I'm not going to leave you alone to face this. I mean that whatever happens next, whatever decisions need to be made about your future, you will not be making them alone. But why? You don't even know me. I know that 5 years ago, a scared little girl gave away her most precious possession to help a stranger be brave. I know that the memory of that little girl got me through the hardest moments of my life. I know that we're connected, you and I, in ways that don't make logical sense but are real nonetheless. Daniel's voice softened. And I know that no child should have to face what you're facing without someone in their corner. Sophie was crying openly now, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. I'm so scared, she managed between breaths. I'm so scared. And I don't know what to do, and everything hurts. And I just want my mom and dad back, and I can't. Daniel moved from the chair to the edge of the bed and gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of her injuries, letting her cry against his chest the way Maya had cried after Aaliyah's death. He held her and rocked her and murmured reassurances that he wasn't sure he believed, but that needed to be said anyway. I know, sweetheart, I know. Let it out, all of it. I've got you. They stayed like that for a long time, the pilot and the girl he'd saved, bound together by tragedy and persistence and the stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. The conversation with Maya was one of the hardest Daniel had ever had. He'd driven back from Boston that night, his mind churning with implications and possibilities. Sophie's situation was complicated, legally, practically, emotionally, but the path forward had become increasingly clear to him during the long hours at her bedside. He wanted to help her. Not just in the abstract, not just with visits and phone calls and occasional support. He wanted to give her what she needed most, a family. But that wasn't a decision he could make alone. You want to adopt her? Maya's voice was carefully neutral as she sat across from him at the kitchen table, the remnants of a hastily prepared dinner between them. I want to foster her initially. Give her a stable home while she recovers, while things get sorted out legally. And then, if it's right for everyone involved, yes, I want to give her a permanent place to belong. Maya was quiet for a long moment. Daniel watched her process the information, watched the emotions flicker across her face, surprise, uncertainty, something that might have been jealousy or might have been fear. She's the girl from the airplane, Maya said finally, the one with the elephant. Yes. And her parents are dead. Yes. And she has no one else. No one. Maya's jaw tightened. She asked for you? Specifically? She asked for the only person she could think of who had saved her before. She asked for the only anchor she had left. And you want to bring her here, into our home, into our family. Daniel reached across the table and took his daughter's hands. Maya, I know this is a lot to ask. I know it changes things. I know it's scary and uncertain, and you have every right to have complicated feelings about it. He paused. But I also know that you are one of the most generous, compassionate people I've ever met. And I'm asking you, not telling you, asking you, if you can find it in your heart to share what we have with someone who has nothing. Maya stared at him for a long moment. Then her eyes drifted to the shelf in the living room where her own stuffed elephant, the one that had come in the mail from a grateful passenger, the twin of Sophie's, sat watching them with button eyes. She saved you, Maya said quietly. That's what you always said. Her elephant saved you. In a way, yes. So now you want to save her back. I want to try. Maya was silent again. Daniel waited, his heart pounding, knowing that this decision wasn't really his to make alone. Whatever happened next would affect his daughter as much as anyone, and she had earned the right to a voice in her own future. Finally, Maya spoke. Okay. Okay? Okay, let's do it. She looked up at him, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. Let's save her back. The next 2 years were a study in transformation. Sophie came to live with them 3 months after that hospital conversation, once the legal complexities had been navigated and her physical injuries had healed enough to allow it. She arrived with a single suitcase, a worn stuffed elephant, and a wariness that Daniel recognized from his own journey through grief. The early months were difficult. Sophie was struggling with survivor's guilt, with depression, with the particular horror of having lost everything in an instant. She had nightmares that sent her screaming through the apartment at 3 a.m. She had days when she couldn't get out of bed, when the weight of her losses pressed down so heavily that breathing seemed like too much effort. Daniel and Maya met her where she was. They learned to read her moods, to recognize the warning signs that a bad day was coming. They developed rituals, Sunday pancakes, Friday movie nights, daily walks in Prospect Park that gave Sophie space to talk or stay silent as she needed. They created a home that was stable without being suffocating, supportive without being overwhelming, and slowly, painfully, Sophie began to heal. The breakthrough came on an ordinary Tuesday, 6 months after she'd moved in. Daniel was in the kitchen making dinner when he heard something that stopped him cold: laughter. Sophie and Maya were in the living room, working on a school project together, and Sophie was laughing. Not the polite, hollow laugh she'd occasionally produced to satisfy social expectations, but a real laugh, full and genuine and unexpected. The sound of someone who had forgotten, for just a moment, how much they had lost. Daniel stood at the stove, tears streaming down his face, listening to that laughter like it was the most beautiful music ever composed. This was what healing sounded like. This was what hope sounded like. This was what family sounded like. The adoption was finalized 18 months after Sophie came to live with them. Daniel had prepared himself for the legal process to be complicated. Sophie was old enough to have opinions, to testify about her wishes, to potentially challenge the arrangement if she chose to. But when the judge asked Sophie if this was what she wanted, if she understood what she was agreeing to, the girl's answer was immediate and unwavering. Daniel saved my life twice, she said, her voice clear and strong. Once on an airplane when I was 8 years old, and once in a hospital when I was 13. He didn't have to do either of those things. He chose to. And that's what family is, isn't it? People who choose each other, people who show up when they don't have to. She looked at Daniel. I choose him. I choose Maya. I choose this family. The judge signed the papers without further questions. That night, they celebrated with a dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant, the same one where Daniel had taken Maya for special occasions since she was small. Sophie sat between them, still a little overwhelmed by the formality of what had just happened, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. So I'm really your daughter now? She asked, as if she still couldn't quite believe it. You're really my daughter now, Daniel confirmed. And Maya's really my sister? Really and truly, Maya said, grinning, which means I get to boss you around, by the way. It's in the sister rulebook. Sophie laughed, That real laugh that Daniel had first heard 6 months ago and still treasured every time it appeared. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel looked at his two daughters, one biological, one chosen, both equally his, and felt a fullness in his heart that he hadn't known was possible. "Now we live," he said. "Now we build a life together, day by day, moment by moment. Now we take care of each other." "That's it? That's it. That's everything." He raised his glass of sparkling cider. "To family." "To family," Maya and Sophie echoed. They clinked glasses and drank, and outside the restaurant windows the city lights sparkled like earthbound stars, and somewhere high above, aircraft traced their patient paths across the darkening sky. The 10th anniversary of Flight 447 was marked by a ceremony in Gander, Newfoundland. Daniel flew out for it with both daughters, returning to the place where everything had ended and everything had begun. The runway where he'd brought the crippled aircraft to rest had long since been repaired, the grass of the overrun area restored to its former green. There was a memorial now, a simple stone marker with the names of the crew and a dedication to the passengers who had survived. And beside it, a small museum documenting the events of that night. 237 of the original 243 passengers had made the journey back. The others had passed away in the intervening years, not from the crash, but from the ordinary causes that claim us all eventually. Their families had come in their place, carrying memories and photographs and stories of survival. Daniel stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people whose lives he had changed, whose futures he had made possible. There was Sophie's grandmother in spirit, represented now by Sophie herself, who sat in the front row with Maya beside her. There was Marcus Chen, the pilot who had frozen in the first cohort and gone on to become one of the program's most celebrated instructors. There was Sarah Mitchell, now a senior captain with a major airline and a reputation for ice-cold calm in emergencies. There was Gregory Patterson, who had funded scholarships for hundreds of aspiring aviators and found his own kind of redemption in the process. There was Captain Richard Harmon, retired now, but still carrying the memory of the night when a stranger had walked into his cockpit and performed a miracle. And there were hundreds of others, passengers who had been terrified strangers on that flight and were now connected by a bond that nothing could break. Daniel took a breath and began to speak. 10 years ago, I was an invisible passenger in seat 8A. I had spent a decade trying to be ordinary, trying to leave behind the person I'd been, trying to build a life that didn't require me to be exceptional. I wanted to disappear into normalcy, to be just a father, just a maintenance worker, just another face in the crowd. He paused, letting the silence settle. And then the sky reminded me that we don't always get to choose who we are. We don't always get to decide which parts of ourselves matter and which parts we can leave behind. Sometimes the universe puts us in situations where everything we've tried to hide, everything we've tried to deny, is exactly what's needed to save the people around us. He looked at Sophie and Maya, sitting side by side, his daughters in every way that mattered. That night, I stood up because I thought about a little girl traveling alone, scared and helpless, trusting strangers to deliver her safely to her grandmother. I stood up because I imagined my own daughter in that seat, and I knew that if she were there, I would want someone to fight for her. I would need someone to fight for her. His voice grew thick with emotion. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that standing up would change everything. That the child I was thinking of would one day become my daughter. That the skills I used to land that aircraft would become the foundation for a training program that has touched thousands of lives. That the worst night of my life would become the beginning of my greatest purpose. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. We don't get to choose our crucibles. We don't get to pick the moments that define us. All we can do is be ready, ready to act when action is required, ready to stand up when standing up is the only option, ready to use whatever we have, whatever we are, in service of the people who need us. He looked out at the crowd one final time. You survived that night because the universe put me in seat 8A. But you also survived because you trusted a stranger, because the crew let go of their doubts, because 243 people refused to give up, even when giving up seemed like the only reasonable response. He smiled. We saved each other that night. We're still saving each other today. And as long as we remember that, as long as we remember that we're all in this together, that we're all passengers on the same flight through life, we will keep saving each other tomorrow and the day after and every day that follows. He stepped back from the podium, Thank you, all of you, for surviving, for being here, for being family. The applause that followed was not the polite acknowledgement of a finished speech. It was something deeper, a release of emotion, a collective exhale, a recognition of shared survival that transcended words. And then, one by one, people began to stand. First the passengers, rising from their seats with tears streaming down their faces. Then their families. Then the crew members who had worked that flight, the investigators who had studied the wreckage, the instructors who had learned from Daniel's techniques. Everyone standing, everyone applauding, everyone bearing witness to what they had survived together. Daniel stood at the podium and let the wave wash over him. He felt Maya's hand find his right hand and Sophie's hand find his left, his daughters anchoring him the way he had once anchored himself to a stuffed elephant. They stood together, the pilot, the chosen daughter, the biological daughter, a family forged in crisis and strengthened by time. This was the ending, Daniel realized. Not the landing, not the survival, not even the rescue. This was the ending, standing in a field in Newfoundland, surrounded by people he had saved and people who had saved him, with his daughter's hands in his and the sky stretching endless above them. This was the ending, knowing that he had mattered, that he would continue to matter, that the ripples of that one impossible night would spread outward forever, touching lives he would never meet, saving futures he would never see. This was the ending, finally, completely, at peace. The flight home was quiet. Maya slept against the window, her face peaceful in the cabin's dim light. Sophie sat between Daniel and the aisle, reading a book about aviation that she'd picked up in the Gander Museum gift shop. She was interested in flying now, had been ever since she came to live with them, and Daniel suspected that one day she would end up in a cockpit herself. The thought made him smile. He looked out the window at the clouds below, at the world spread out beneath them like a promise. Somewhere down there were people living their lives, making their choices, standing up when standing up mattered, and staying down when staying down was all they could manage. Somewhere down there, the next crisis was forming. The next emergency that would test someone's limits, the next ordinary person who would be called upon to do something extraordinary. He hoped they would be ready. He hoped the training programs would reach them, the techniques would stick, the mindset would take root. He hoped that when their moment came, when the systems failed and the procedures ran out, and they were left alone with nothing but their own capabilities, they would find within themselves what he had found on that impossible night, the courage to act, the wisdom to improvise, the love to anchor them when everything else fell away. That was his legacy, not the landing, not the fame, not even the training program that bore his name. His legacy was the permission to be brave, the proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, the reminder that we are all, every one of us, pilots of our own lives, and that the sky doesn't care about our doubts or our fears or our limitations. The sky only cares whether we fly. Sophie looked up from her book and caught him watching her. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Daniel smiled and put his arm around her, pulling her close. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," he said. "I'm thinking about how strange and beautiful life is, how it gives us exactly what we need even when we can't see it, how the worst moments can become the foundations for the best ones." That's very philosophical for 2 in the morning. It's a philosophical kind of night. Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, her book forgotten. "Thank you, Dad," she said quietly. It was the first time she'd called him that. Dad, not Daniel. The word settled into his heart like it had always belonged there. "For what, sweetheart?" "For saving me, both times. For giving me a family, for—" She paused, searching for the right words. "For showing me that it's possible to survive the unsurvivable, that there's always something on the other side of the worst thing if you're brave enough to reach for it." Daniel pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You showed me the same thing, Sophie, you and Maya both. You showed me that the point of surviving isn't just to keep breathing. It's to keep loving, to keep connecting, to keep building something worth surviving for." They sat together in the darkened cabin, father and daughter, as the aircraft carried them home. Outside the window, stars scattered across the velvet darkness like promises, like possibilities, like the infinite potential of a universe that never stopped offering second chances. Daniel Brooks closed his eyes and let himself drift. He had been a pilot, a father, a hero, a teacher. Now he was something simpler and more profound, a man who had found his way home. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the only ending that had ever mattered.